Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Children, Young People and Families Cabinet Panel. I'm County Councillor Teresa Heritage. I'm the chairman for today, and I'm also lead member for Children, Young People and Families. I've got an announcement to make, and this is in relation to COVID-19. Due to the coronavirus pandemic, the Council will be holding this meeting electronically in accordance with the relevant regulations. Members of the public may also attend this meeting in an electronic capacity, and there is a link on the Council's website for them to do so. Members of the Council are asked to keep their microphones switched off until called to speak, and to switch their microphones off once they have finished speaking. Cameras may be left on throughout the meeting if members wish. If you experience connection or other technical issues, it may help to switch your camera off. Cameras should be switched on if and when speaking in the meeting. To indicate a wish to speak, please members, use the raised hand function. Use of the meeting chat function is exclusively for voting. At the end of the debate on each item of business, there will be a vote. Members should vote using the meeting chat function by indicating for, against, or abstain. I will declare the result after each vote. Excuse me. Breaks of at least 15 minutes will be held every 2 hours. I might hold them more frequently and will be taken after a speaker in the debate has finished speaking. If we are voting, the vote will be concluded before the break is taken. Oh, excuse me. Other breaks will be incorporated as appropriate. To assure you, it's not COVID, it's just a dry throat. Membership changes. Seamus Quilty is subbing for Leslie Greensmith for this meeting. Thank you very much, Seamus, for stepping up today.
Thank you.
Apologies, Leslie Greensmith. We now come to members' interests. Just a reminder to disclose any pecuniary interests, etc., as when we come to the item if you haven't declared them previously. Members are advised that in respect of the debate concerning the Council's integrated plan, including the setting of the Council tax precept, the Standards Committee has exercised its power to grant a dispensation to all Hertfordshire County councillors from the requirement to declare any disclosable pecuniary interest or a declarable interest. Accordingly, there is no requirement for any councillor to make any declaration of interest in respect of this item of business. Members are reminded that Section 106 of the Local Government Finance Act 1992 provides that if a member is in arrears of council tax for 2 months or more, and they are present at a meeting where the council's budget or the precept is being considered, then they should declare this, and such member must not vote on any matter relating to the setting of the council's budget or precept. The provisions of Section 106 of the Local Government Finance apply even if there is an arrangement to pay off arrears. So today we have the following councillors in attendance: Nigel Bell, Helen Campbell, Dee Hart, Paula Hiscox, Graham Lawrence, Mark Mills Bishop, Seamus Quilty, Anthony Rowlands, Fiona Thompson and Mark Watkin. So thank you, colleagues, for coming to the meeting today. We'll now move to the main agenda. Minutes of the previous meeting held on the 11th of November. Do I have any comments, please? Okay, so we'll move through the minutes and I'll look at the action points. So the first one is in para 3.4. And I think this was just noted that the KPI on staff retention and staff numbers would be added to the workforce strategy group or brought to the attention. Jo, can you confirm that that's taken place?
That is taking place, yeah, absolutely, Jo.
Thank you very much. I should say Jo Fisher, our Director of Children's Services. Thank you. Item 3.6. Is this one?
Chair, if I may,
yes.
There was a question around young people and experiencing serious violence,
yes,
under 3.6, and I agreed that a future panel we would bring back a report on everything we're doing around serious violence, and we're looking at dates to table that for a future panel meeting.
Okay, lovely, thank you very much. Item 3.7 is around sustainability, and was that circulated, please? Do we know?
I'm just, is Marion Ingram on the call? I'm not sure. No, it doesn't look like she's...
Yes, I am on the call. Yes, I am on the call. I don't know. I'm going to have to go back and check, Jo.
Okay, that's lovely. Thanks, Marion. Action 4.2.
That's in the paper that we'll come to later on today. Yeah.
Yep, and I think flicking through
7.2.
7.2.
Absolutely. So yeah, we that's just a future action that we agree to keep the panel informed as we move forward, Chair.
Excellent, thank you. 7.6. That's going to be provided in the future.
We'll bring that as a future report and update on the adoption service.
That's right. And another one.
Again, same point. That was in relation to numbers of children with special educational needs who have been adopted, and again, we can bring that as a future report.
Yep, thank you. And then that's that. Good. So thank you for that. So members, can we agree the minutes, please, of the previous meeting? Please, could you indicate in chat? If your chat isn't working, can you just sort of shout out? Thank you. Have we all voted? Okay, that's been agreed. Thank you very much, colleagues. Item 2 on the agenda is public petitions. There have been none. And now we move to item 3, which is the integrated plan 22-23 to 25-26 for this portfolio. And Faisal Mir, Director of Finance and Business Support, will provide a presentation. Thank you, Faisal. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Morning all. Hope everyone's well. So I'll just give a very brief introduction, just really covering two things. So firstly, just in terms of process, just to remind panel members of where we are in the process and what we're asking panel to do today. It's summarised in section 3 of the panel paper, in that we're asking panel to do two things. Firstly, to recommend to Cabinet the IP proposals in relation to children, young people and families, and secondly, to identify any issues that you feel Cabinet should consider in finalising the IP proposals. So, and this is part of the wider process where the draft IP figures went through January Cabinet, and since then, as is the usual process, the proposals have been out to public consultation. We've had the review by overview and scrutiny, And then today's panel is a sort of final piece in that jigsaw as the proposals go through to February Cabinet and February Council. So that's where we are in terms of the process. In terms of the substance, the paper does two things. The first thing it does, which we provide very much to every panel, is it provides an overview of the IP across the entire council. I wasn't going to dwell on that, but happy to answer any questions that colleagues may have. The main thing it then does is it signposts to the relevant section of the IP pack. So what I might do, Chair, with your permission, is just very briefly share that on screen. Just I'm sure everyone knows it like the back of their hand by now, but just to remind colleagues of the main changes as it pertains to budgets in the IP, okay. And I'll keep it very brief.
Yep, but that's fine. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. So if I just pull out maybe the top 3 or 4 key changes. The first one I draw colleagues' attention to is a number of these lines, particularly SSC 6, D5 and OP12, all relate to our independent placements budget. You know, that essentially the cost of placing children in care, and I'm sure panels heard many times that has showing a particular increase in financial terms because the increase in numbers we've seen recently and the increase in complexity, which a number of councils are seeing, but you know, very much driven by the impact of the pandemic. And as noted in the wider IP papers, we are working up proposals to mitigate that pressure and that we're seeing and that demand we're seeing coming through the system. The second item I'd draw colleagues' attention to is OP112. So as we can see here, this is the costs as it pertains to SEND home to school transport. And in line with that increase in demand we're seeing for SEND generally, we're also seeing that filter through to costs and demand on home to school transport for children with SEND. So this forecast very much reflects that forecast increase in demand because you know, we have essentially a statutory responsibility to provide transport. You know, as with all things, we're trying to do what we can to ensure best value for money and you know, throughout, but in essence this is very much a demand-led budget. And the last item I'd maybe draw attention to, which I know we're coming back to later in the agenda, is there is investment of there's 1.7 million in this portfolio, and then another element that sits in the education portfolio, but this is very much as it says here about investment, 1.7 million in this particular portfolio of investment in the statutory SEND pathways in resources really to help deal with that growing demand we're seeing. So intentionally I was going to keep it very brief at that point, Chair, if that's okay, but very happy to answer any questions that panel members may have.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much, Faisal. Before we go into questions and debate, I just want to say something or say a little bit, as this is the only place really I get an opportunity not to be cut down on time because I'm in control of that, so which is quite nice. But I do assure you, colleagues, you'll have plenty of time to say whatever you wish. So I'd like to say the 275,000 plus children and young people in the county have, in my opinion, been the most affected by the pandemic, but they've done terrifically well, and I, for one, are really proud of them. But in a battle, some people will always be more affected, and in many instances, this has been our more vulnerable children, but also our teenagers. Let's face it, it's tough being a teenager anyway, and so over the last 2 years, it's been even tougher. So I'm very pleased that this year the IP has had more focus, I feel, on children and young people, in particular on the health and fulfilment of the lives they live. There is an additional 29 million being provided over the next 4 years, an increase of 17%. But more importantly, in order to deal with the immediate impact of COVID, an additional 18 million will be available in 22-23, a 10% increase on 21-22. Some of the areas that I would like to highlight is in relation to, first of all, children coming into care or young people. Complexity of need has risen in the number of adolescents being affected, mostly due to family breakdown and the impact of emotional and mental health problems. Over the IP period, an additional 10 million revenue will be allocated from the 18 million to ensure there is sufficient funding to support this vulnerable cohort. To support our SASH service, that Special Adolescent Safeguarding Hub, it's a network sort of thing, to continue to recruit and retain foster carers. This is to negate and decrease dependence on independent foster places. We've also got MCR pathways, prioritising investment in our most vulnerable children in care and those with a social worker. An additional 530,000 of Invest to Transform monies will be used to continue to support MCR Pathways mentoring support programme in 9 Hertfordshire schools and to expand to a further 3. The mentoring programme is designed to help reduce exclusions, increase attainment and the post-school progress to university, college or employment. Faisal's already mentioned SEND. This is another area of major concern for the council and has been the continued increase of EHCPs that have come into the system. We have worked with our partners and undertaken an in-depth review of the whole service, and we'll hear more on that later. To that end, we are investing an additional 2 million in the service to manage growth in demand and create a sustainable service with targeted early intervention. This will be in addition to the additional 300 special school places that will be delivered over the next 3 to 5 years. Across the whole children's services budget, excluding high needs educational funding, the 39.2 million spending in 21-22 will rise to 44.6 million in 22-23. During the pandemic, we have seen a steady increase in referrals to children's services. It is essential that we keep families and children, young people, sufficiently supported as we come out of COVID. £3 million of COVID recovery funding has already been allocated for this purpose to boost the support we have been able to give. This is in addition to investment to support children and families in a bid to mitigate the impact of COVID-induced poverty and neglect, with 2.2 million being allocated to the Building Life Chances programme. There is also the government-funded Happy Holidays, as we call it, food programme in Hertfordshire of £2.8 million. Partnership across the system is essential to support families and safeguard children. And importantly, in the adult care budget, I welcome the £1 million to support domestic abuse services, which will have, I hope, a positive impact on keeping children safe. Can I also say we've got a great staff working incredibly hard to make sure that children, young people and families will get the right help at the right time. And this IP will add both strength and depth to their endeavours to continue to keep all of our children safe, healthy and happy and feel included in society. Thank you, colleagues, for indulging me. I expect you'll hear that speech again a few more times over the coming weeks, but you've heard it first here. So let me just have a look at the hands. I've seen them going up. Okay, so the first hand I have is D Hart, please.
Thank you, Chair. Could Faisal confirm, please, that SEND home school transport, the service manages and administers the policies for young people up to the age of 25, but the delivery of the transport is undertaken by the environment on behalf of children's services via a service level agreement, that there will be a £6 million a year of additional money being spent on transport to schools in 2025-26. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, just to confirm, Councillor Hart, exactly as you say, it's is that pressure OP 112 on page 113. So in line with that demand, as delivered by our environment colleagues, exactly as you say, we're forecasting to put in an extra 5.7 million in that year 25-26, and it's very much to meet that demand that we're anticipating in the coming years. So absolutely correct.
And could you just confirm that a £2 million investment in SEND to manage growth in demand and create a sustainable service with target early intervention, please?
Yes, absolutely. So that's the pressure that's on there as well, that I highlighted in passing, OP 114. And again, just to be clear, 1.7 million appears in this portfolio, and that the remainder that gets the 2 million appears in the education portfolio. And I know it's a topic for conversation later on, but I think we were very mindful of part of the IP process to put additional resources in to support that growing demand. So absolutely agree with your characterisation, Councillor Hart.
Thank you. And Chair, can you just indulge me one last time, please? Because I do think this is a good news story, and I think it's something that we should share and be proud to share with the residents across Hertfordshire. Can you just confirm, please, Faisal, that £10 million to ensure there is sufficient funding to support the increase in numbers and complexity of children looked after across Hertfordshire, please?
Yes, absolutely. So that is the sum total of those various pressures that I highlighted. And again, the chair very much flagged that increase in demand that we're seeing, and it's very much to meet that demand and the needs of those children. The other point I'd use the opportunity to reiterate, Councillor, if that's okay, is that, as I mentioned, alongside that, and as flagged in the IP, we're also thinking about future service models and future delivery models to help deal with that demand and help support our children in care. So that's something we're very much working up alongside that pressure, and will be coming through the political process in the coming weeks and months. So absolutely, we're putting money aside to meet that growing need, but also thinking about how we continue to improve and how we meet the needs of those children going forwards.
Thank you. Can I just thank the director and her team for all the hard work behind the scenes that go into make sure that these services are fit for purpose for all the residents within Hertfordshire. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Dee. Jo, did you want to add anything at all?
No, no, Chair. I think Faisal covered it off very, very, very well. So we thank Councillor Hart for her comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark Mills-Bishop, please.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. Final pressures.
Mark, you've turned yourself off. You're still off. No. Okay.
Right, am I back? Yeah, I'm
yes.
back. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Faisal, for the presentation. Talking of pressures that you were mentioning, inflation is running at what, 5%, I think, at the moment. Any thoughts around inflation and how that may impact upon our delivery services, that kind of thing? Because we know that perhaps the forecast in April is it will go up to about 7.5. Any thoughts around that?
No, absolutely. So as with all portfolios, we've put aside an assumption on inflation in particularly on our contracts and various other elements. I think you're right, Councillor, to raise that as a risk, and it's a cross-council risk. The way we're managing that risk through the IP is very much as a cross-council risk. So it's flagged. If you look under the central part of the IP, there's a section titled Risks and Uncertainties. And as part of that, we set aside central contingency across the council to the tune of about 8.6 million, I think it is, from memory. And inflation is one of a number of pressures that I suppose that contingency is there for us to draw upon should it really materialise. So I think there's two elements to that, Councillor. There's, in so much as inflation might impact our costs and materialise in additional costs, I think corporate contingency and central contingency is what we'd look to draw on as a council. I suppose the other side to inflation is how it impacts children, young people and families, which maybe is a wider question and something we're very mindful of and have been flagging through the risk register to the audit committee for a considerable period. So I think, and Jo and others will be far better versed in that, but I think we need to be mindful of that risk as it impacts families as well in the coming weeks and months as well.
Okay. No, thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, Mark.
Thank you, Faisal.
Thank you. I've now got Nigel Bell.
Thank you, Chair. Nigel Bell, West Watford, Labour spokesman on Children's Services, and thank you for your the piece you did at the start. Respect that. Although actually I was trying to catch up with the other point you issued at the we only got at 9:15, so I was just trying to read that. But yeah, from my point of view, we did have a pretty good scrutiny of the Children's Services budget proposals 2 weeks ago, and I of course welcome the extra spending on our more complex vulnerable children and the extra spending on our children looked after, which I'll ask about in a minute. And also clearly in today's meeting and going on, the emphasis on SEN, special educational needs, is vital, and obviously we're going to return to that later in the panel. Can I just raise, maybe with Faisal again, a couple of the questions that I took up in the Children's Services scrutiny, and one of the things I raised was obviously whether the welcome of new build sites within the county will be enough to make sure we have not only more of our most vulnerable looked after children housed in Hertfordshire, but whether it is better value for money. And I think that is relevant as well when you think in the papers on page 51, saying children looked after numbers in Hertfordshire have risen in the age group 13 to 15. The data shows that these children are staying in care until the age of 18. And of course, the implication for budgetary challenges are that the average cost of all children looked after is approximately £52,000 per year. And typically young people who enter care during the secondary school years stay in the system longer. So that's the context of trying to have more children within our own county and how this will save money, but we need to be thinking about them anyway. Obviously that's the most important thing, just to think of their welfare. But if you could just look at that. And then the other question, if I can say it now, is obviously OP 114. As we all know, that's the point of the budget, where I'd said to investigate whether the resources promised for our special education needs children and families will cover the increasingly complex needs of our most vulnerable children. And I know we're obviously going to be talking a lot about special educational needs later on, but that was one of the key questions and points that I raised and that we discussed, and whether that extra funding of the 1.5, 1.6 will be enough because of those extra complex or more complex vulnerable children. So I don't know if Faisal could come back at least on that first point. Thank you.
So Faisal, do you want to cover off any money bits? Otherwise, I think I'll bring Joe in.
No, absolutely. If I start and then Joe, feel free to fill any gaps I leave, isn't it? So Councillor Bell, you're absolutely right to flag the importance of our residential strategy, which I think you're talking about, and the sort of increase of local provision of children homes. I think if I understood you right, there's almost two elements to your question. There's, is 31 the right number? Is it the right number to be targeting? And I suppose there's a question about value for money. And again, taking each of those in turn, as colleagues might remember, when we took the business case through back in September 2019, the number of 31 was very much a data-led number. It was based on a sort of a long-standing trajectory of the number of children we have had in residential care. So I think we were confident that was the right number to go with, and very much based on data and evidence in that sense. And in value for money terms, I'll need to scramble around to find the numbers, but just to reassure in general terms, in-house residential is absolutely cheaper than procuring it on the independent market. Off the top of my head, I think the independent providers cost about £4,500 to £5,000 a week, whereas our in-house provision costs significantly less than that. And that is often because sometimes, as with all councils, we're in a weaker negotiating position because of the state of the market, and providers can unfortunately sometimes name their price on these things. Very sadly, it's just the state of affairs with the market. So I think a lot of this comes back to a very simple point about being in control of our own destiny, about having that sort of pipeline of places that we control and are able to manage. So we're not, in the destinies of providers who can name their price for want of a better phrase. So Hopefully that answers your question. Maybe I'll pause on that and then we come back to the point on send, but I don't know if Joe, if there's, or Marion, even if there's anything you want to add on the residential strategy.
The only point I would add, and Marion, do come in if you want to add to this, is that alongside everything that I think that Faisal's put so well, is we are of course also really driving our foster care strategy, which is all about recruiting more foster carers for Hertfordshire children within Hertfordshire boundaries, and that represents not only a better outcome for children and young people because they live in a family environment, in a family home, but also represents better value for money because of course foster care placements are indeed cheaper than residential placements. So again, there's the value for money piece is something we're considering, Nigel, across a number of different strategies with a real focus first and foremost of making sure that children and young people have the best outcomes, but also securing value for money in how we achieve those outcomes. We can move on to the send question, Nigel, if that answers your first question. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. On the SEND one, and again, Faisal, do come in. The 1.9 million in total, 1.7 across this portfolio, provides the opportunity both for really increasing the capacity of our frontline teams, and I know we'll talk about that point later, but really bringing in some additional capacity and resilience across our statutory SEND teams. But secondly, a great opportunity to think about how to manage demand better and differently. So this panel will be aware from many discussions over the previous years that we're seeing significant pressure across all of our SEND services, both council but also health services. And what we're looking to do is to think about how we provide help earlier on so that children and young people with SEND and their families get the right help at the right time, in the right place, and in doing so prevent their needs escalating so that they go on to need, specialist provision or out of county schools, that sort of provision. We want to, where we can, manage need and support need in our local mainstream schools and special schools so that children and young people have their needs met timely and locally. So again, the only point in addition I would make, Councillor Bell, would be that we will keep this under review, and we are confident that we will begin to make a difference to the increase in demand that we've been seeing in recent years. But I do think it's something we need to keep reviewing, we need to keep monitoring and reporting back on, so that we are able to make sure that children and young people have their needs met. Okay, thank you, Chair. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So I'm pleased, obviously, with the answer, but also the fact that it's going to need to be under constant review, taking into account obviously what Faisal has to do is from the finance side. But the extra money's been put in, the 1.9 million, you say, the overall. But the key thing is, as I think everybody understands, especially on SEND, that there are big problems in trying to get this sorted out. But obviously, we obviously need to try and hold to account the fact that you're saying you're going to keep this under review and things are changing all the time. So we will keep an eye on that. But thank you initially anyway for those answers. Thank you.
Yeah, could I actually also add that we need to bear in mind that this coming spring, hopefully by the end of March, the government will have issued its SEND review, and I understand that there's some interesting things going to be included in that, which hopefully, as Hertfordshire's fed into it, will be helpful. Fingers crossed.
We're all waiting with bated breath for that.
Yeah, waiting for bated breath, absolutely. So, but we'll cover this a bit more later on. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Mark Watkin.
Thank you very much, Terry, and for the sake of people attending, I am Mark Watkin. I'm the Lib Dem opposition spokesperson for Children's Services, and I'm not intending to repeat everything that Nigel's just said. I think all the points he's raised are absolutely pertinent. I want to just raise the question of risk associated with some of these predictions. A lot of emphasis has been placed on the need to increase the workforce of the SEND team. The workforce, the case numbers at the moment are just unbelievable to people who don't know. The case officer now has about 380 children that they have to look after on their casework. And we hope to get the numbers down. We must get the numbers down, but I'm just very concerned about how the risks are rated in terms of this particular challenge. And the same is also to be said about getting our accommodation on stream in time for the placement. So I'm going to look more at risk rather than the numbers, because Nigel's done a great job on the numbers. So I wanted just to get a view from Faisal and Joe as to which are the riskiest areas they think in hoping to achieve. And in passing, before I pass over to them, Terry, you made a reference to the green paper that's coming out, and I know from conversations with Jo that she is concerned that one of the biggest issues nationally is that there's no clear identification of what a well-run SEND service should be in terms of workload and deliverables. There is for child protection, but there isn't for SEND. So I'm taking the opportunity publicly to say I hope that the authority will stress the need for clear guidance from central government, because behind that then comes a true funding plan that will help make that happen. But if you don't have that picture in hand, then really it's very hard to know quite how to use the resources to the best effect. But my main question is around risk. So can I hand it back to you?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Shall I kick off and then
Yes,
Joe,
please,
feel free.
Faisal. Yes.
So again, I don't mean to be trite, Councillor Watkin, but I think it's a very good question, isn't it? I think what I'd say that there's risk down both of those key projects you talked about, the residential strategy and the SND. But without being trite, I suppose I'd just flag we're very mindful of the risks and we're trying to mitigate them wherever possible. So, you know, taking out the residential strategy first, thinking about the key risks there. There's absolutely a risk that we continue to get sort of local opposition when we put forward individual cases, but we continue to, you know, work with, you know, local residents and really try and sell the importance of these sites being in place. There's also a risk around staffing, but as colleagues will know, we're very much actively seeking to mitigate that with some really good work Marion's leading around setting up a residential staff academy. You know, it's something we're very much leading, I think, on regionally and nationally, and trying to address the challenge. So I think staffing and getting the planning permission on sites are particular risks I'd flag on the residential, but they're very much issues we're trying to work through. On the SEND side, you know, there is a risk around, you know, that demand continuing to escalate and continuing to rise above and beyond even what our forecasts are. But in terms of mitigation, colleagues will be aware we're working very closely with Empower and other colleagues trying to think about what we can do to manage that demand. And, you know, the real key to that, and Joe and others will be far better versed in this than me, and I think the SEND strategy, the SEND review, will speak to this, is what role mainstream schools can play in managing SEND. And I think that's really a critical part of our mitigation there. Beyond that, you know, the risk is, as you said, about, making sure those caseloads are manageable. And again, the way we're mitigating that is as best we can, designing the pathways and designing our structures to make those caseloads manageable and kind of deal with that in the best way possible. So I think Joe can come in to fill the gaps, but I just, without being trite, flag there's absolutely risk on both, but we're seeking to mitigate those as best we can. And anything of this scale, there will inevitably risk. It's just about trying to keep on top of those risks and mitigate to the best of our abilities. What I'd flag.
Okay.
Thanks, Faisal. Thank you, Chair. I think Faisal pretty much covered it off there. Just to briefly say, I think the kinds of pressures we're seeing both across, our children and care services and our SEND services are to a significant extent demand-led or need-led. And you're absolutely right, Councillor Watkins, because those needs, those demands, we can see volatility in how that can fluctuate, particularly if you consider the pandemic. There is, of course, risk in all of our predictions. That said, as Faisal set out, we've got strong plans in place to mitigate risk across the whole, children and care services and SEND, and Faisal's just touched on a couple of those. The one I would probably single out for consideration would be around staffing and staff recruitment, both in terms of our residential sector and our SEND sector. On a national level, there are difficulties in recruiting staff into both those areas of work. And we are working really hard to think about how to, attract well-equipped, well-experienced staff into those sectors, and doing everything we can to bring staff in. And then secondly, the point that Faisal made around schools, around and how we support children with SEND in mainstream schools. Again, that's one of the central planks of our SEND strategy that we talked about, I think, in the last panel, really thinking about how we support children to have their needs met in mainstream schools. And that's everything about early help, early support for children and young people with SEND. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And Mark, can I just come back on your point about the SEND review? As you know and others know, I actually sit on the LGA's Children and Young People's Board, so I'm actually feeding in there as well. So we keep involved in a Hertfordshire context, and I also keep Hertfordshire involved in a national context via the LGA. I should reiterate that we're not the only authority that has this problem. I think every 152 of them do in some shape or form. And actually, although some people might not think it, we actually are one of the better managed authority. We do manage our children well as we can. I did talk to the Children's Minister last week when he visited Hertfordshire, and not on SEND. He didn't visit about SEND. He actually visited in relation to the work that the virtual school is doing. But I had an opportunity to talk to him around the SEND review, which he's actually leading. This is Will Quince, and reiterated the points that you've made, because it's what we all know. We all know the problems, and we all agree with the problems, and it's just trying to ensure that our voice is heard, and that the government are taking it on board. In relation to staff recruitment, he was well aware that something had to be done nationally, and some of the recruitment is not just in local authorities, it's the NHS as well. That there's a challenge there. So we did talk about training and investment into training of all categories of professional required in the SEND world. So I do assure you, I'm trying to keep on top of it, and I'll always speak up for Hertfordshire and do our best. But again, we will cover this later on in the SEND items. We've got quite a few coming up. So is that okay, Mark? We'll stop there.
Terry, look, we're going to be on your tail. Obviously, we just want these children to get the best possible outcomes, and anything you can do through your influence at national level, we will support absolutely. We just have to get it sorted. Thank you.
Thank you. So what I would say, actually, that this will take a bit of time. We're talking about especially increasing workloads, changing culture. It involves human beings, so we all have to be sensitive and work with our colleagues as well. So I thank you for that. So that's got a few more hands come up now. So Dee, you were the first one up, but I'll come back to you unless it's relevant to what we've just been talking about, and I'll bring in two others before I come to you, if that's all right, because you've had a go already. Is that okay?
That's absolutely fine, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. So Anthony.
Thank you, Terry. I'm not sure whether my camera's working, but never mind. Just probably more an observation, a question. I know there are areas where, you know, the excellent practice we have in Hertfordshire is one that other authorities learn from and visit us. In one of the SEND briefings, I understood that actually you are reaching out to other authorities to where one senses that things have perhaps been done more effectively, to learn from good practice elsewhere, and that sounded like a sensible thing to be doing.
Doesn't want to. That's better. Didn't want to come off mute. Joe, do you want to comment on that?
Just to welcome.
Joe, do you want to comment on that?
Sorry, there's a bit of a...
to welcome.
I've got an echo. Apologies. It's gone. Good. Yeah, I just wanted to welcome Councillor Ronan's comments. Of course, we do across all our areas of work in children's services constantly look externally around how we can learn from other areas, think about best practice, benchmark our own practice compared to other local authorities. And SEND is, of course, one of those that we're keen to do that with. So we have been, you know, I am part of a panel which involves directors of children's services from other areas, thinking about how we share best practice, how we think outside of the box around making sure that we address needs in the most effective way. So absolutely, yes, we're constantly welcoming learning from other areas and thinking about how we can use that learning to build our own practice.
Thank you. Paula.
Thank you, Chair. Really pleased to hear some of the things you were saying, Joe and Faisal, especially about looking at increasing foster carers. I think that is often the best placement for our children, keeping children within Hertfordshire rather than sending them out, which is expensive and means travelling, etc., for them and any visitors. Most importantly, touching on keeping children in mainstream education. I am really supportive of this. If they get the right support, it can start from very early years and stop things escalating, making sure that they get the skills in place, the support in place to manage other problems, and can make a much more successful career path for them in education and obviously in later life. Just wondering, do we have any tracking on how many children we actually keep in mainstream or manage to keep in mainstream at the moment? Thank you.
Do you mean children with SEND specifically, Paula?
Yes, yes. So we manage to, with support, and if it's right for them, keep them in mainstream education rather than having to put them.
Yeah. We do have those figures. I don't have them to hand, Paula. We certainly, I know that a significant proportion of our children with SEND, so those, by that I mean children with SEN support and those with education healthcare plans, are educated within mainstream schools in Hertfordshire. It's a significant number. So I don't have it to my fingers at the moment, Paula. We can certainly bring that back to a future meeting.
Lovely. Thank you, Jo.
Okay, thanks, Paula. Dee.
Thank you, Chairman. Since the national SEND reforms in 2015, Hertfordshire has seen a rise in the number of children with educational healthcare plans of approximately 127%, which would be equivalent approximately, I appreciate Faisal was a lot better on these figures than I am, of a rise of approximately 15% each year. Now, that's right across our SEND services. Now, I appreciate we were giving additional spend, 1.5 million spend in 21-22, and of course 2 million in the IP going forward, which is to be more than welcome. I also acknowledge that there will be greater support provided to schools and the planned provision of 13 additional autism hubs and 300 additional special school places across Hertfordshire, which will come on stream in the next 5 years. I think that is to be welcome. And I wonder if the director can probably update the committee a little bit of the good work work that's being done across Hertfordshire at the moment. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Hart. You mean in relation to our special school place planning, I think?
Absolutely.
Just check. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so as you say, we've got a robust special provision plan in place, which informs the expansion of our special schools over the next 3 years. And you quite rightly touched on the expansion of over 300 new special school places, and indeed our specialist resource provisions, which are built alongside and as part of mainstream schools to provide support for children with autism and social communication difficulties. And those are indeed coming on track. Our secondary places, specialist provision places, are due to come on stream in next September 2023, and then our primary ones thereafter. So a number of those projects are already really well advanced to meet additional and future need, and we've reported on that on a number of occasions. As you know, the current situation is that we are experiencing very high demand for special school places, which we're actively seeking to address through additional solutions at the moment. And I think in the short term, there are a number of young people in our mainstream schools who have specialist provisions named, who are indeed waiting to move on to those specialist provisions. And we're aware of that, and we're working incredibly hard at the moment to think about how we can address that need for September of this year. What I would say is that those in our mainstream schools are supported through a banded funding system. So those schools do get additional funding in order to meet the needs of those children, whilst we really do escalate our plans around rapid expansion of specialist provision across Hertfordshire. Alongside though that, Dee, and you did touch on this, is that we really are thinking about how we support our mainstream schools as well to meet the needs of children with SEND. And we've almost doubled the amount of high needs funding going into our mainstream schools over the last 2 years to do that. And we're really pleased that that is providing our mainstream schools with additional support, additional provision, so that they can work with children and young people in mainstream classes through the mainstream curriculum. And when we know the outcomes for those children are very good if they can continue to have their needs met in mainstream schools. So our strategy is broad. There's a huge amount of work going on in the face of immense pressures and immense demand at the moment for specialist provision.
Can I thank the director and her team once again, because clearly it shows that we're listening to families, we're listening to our residents across Hertfordshire regarding the SEND, and it's nice to know that we're being proactive going forward and not reactive to certain issues that have come forward. So thank you again to the director and her team. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Dee. Okay, colleagues. Oh, where's my crib sheet? Sorry. Got engrossed in the debate there. So we now move on to the recommendations, as I have no more indications to speak. And the recommendations are in 3.1. The panel is invited to recommend to Cabinet the proposals relating to the integrated plan in respect of children, young people and families. And the panel in 3.2, the panel is also asked to identify any issues that it feels that the Cabinet should consider in finalising the integrated plan proposals. Well, I think we've certainly heard everybody's comments on what's important, and I will ensure that those points are heard by Cabinet. So please could I ask you all to vote in relation to the recommendations 3.1 and 3.2. Please, thank you. I'm not sure if my vote got through or not. No, it hasn't yet. Okay. So we have 7 for the recommendation, 1 abstain and 2 oppose. So have we captured everybody's vote there?
Teresa, may I apologise? Mine should have been opposed.
Yeah, no, that's what I was thinking. That's okay, Anthony.
Yeah, no, that's what I was thinking. That's okay, Anthony.
Thank you. So, officers, could you change the results, please?
So, officers, could you change the results, please?
And there was 1 abstain from Nigel Bell.
And there was 1 abstain from Nigel Bell.
Yep.
That's correct, Teresa.
Okay, lovely. Yep. Thank you very much.
Teresa. Okay, lovely. Thank you very much.
I'm not quite sure what I'm echoing. Anthony, could you turn off your microphone?
I'm not quite sure what I'm echoing. Anthony, could you turn off your microphone, please?
Hello.
There we go. Yep, that's normally the case. Lovely. Thank you very much. Okay, so thank you for that, colleagues. We now move on to item 4, which is the Q2 performance report being delivered by Paul Dryden, who is Senior Performance Improvement Manager. So, Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm just going to share my screen 1 second. Right, hopefully everyone can see that. So just to start, so this is Q2 performance, so it's looking at the time period between July and September. Conscious that that's quite some time away now, so what I'll do as I'm going through, I'll give members a more up-to-date picture as to sort of where we are at the end of December as well, and I'll circulate these slides after so everyone's got a note of them as well. As always, and for those who haven't been here before, it's a highlight report. So if there's anything else within the wider report that you've received, if you want to raise any points on that, just let me know at the end of the presentation. And just to note that because we've got 2 further items around SEND, I won't go into any detail around education, health and care plans performance. I'll leave that for the item that's later on in the agenda. So first, starting with our targeted services and early help, we had 147 Families First assessments completed within the Families First service and 101 assessments completed within the SASH service. As you can see, that those numbers are lower than the previous historical figures. And one of the reasons behind that is actually that some cases have been open a bit longer than they have been previously. And you'll see that as a sort of theme as we go throughout the report, is that families have got more complex needs at the moment as a sort of what's come out from what's happened with the pandemic over the last 2 years. What's interesting though with Families First is that the numbers coming in through the front door now, so referrals coming into Families First, have actually returned back to pre-pandemic levels now, which is really good, showing that sort of the service is returning back to a normal level, but it's those that are moving through the system aren't moving through as fastly as they would have done historically. So next, moving on to referrals and to social care. As you see here, the green line, that's the activity that's happened from March onwards. So from April through to September in this financial year and March in the previous financial year. What happened back in March, that was when the schools reopened completely and thankfully haven't shut since. And what we saw there was a large increase in referrals coming into children's social care, and it's been higher than during the pandemic. well. So between April and December, we know that referrals on average have been 20% higher. And as you can see, every month except for May in the last year have actually been considerably higher than previous years. And again, that reflects the increase in complexity that's coming in. What we've seen is actually during the pandemic, the number of referrals from police increased, and the number of referrals that came from schools decreased considerably. When schools returned, their levels have returned to similar to previously or slightly higher, but the police level of referrals has actually maintained its pandemic level and not gone back to its pre-pandemic level, and that's where we're starting to see more referrals coming in, and we're continuing to see referrals from the police that mention domestic abuse as a factor. That's something that started during the pandemic and has increased throughout. So next, moving on to initial child protection conferences. So statutory guidance is that from the point that it's decided that there should be a child protection investigation, which is called the Section 47 investigation, we have 15 days in which we need to schedule an initial child protection conference where we get all of the key partners involved in that case into one room, and they'll discuss whether we think the young person should go onto a child protection plan. The good news of this is that performance has been really strong this in the quarter that we're reporting. We had 97% in July, 93% in August, and 91% in September. Actually, in December, we actually hit 98%, which was only one conference out of timescale. And what's really good with this is actually it's despite increase in the actual number of conferences, so increased demand, we're still managing to hold those really important conferences within timescale to make sure that the children that are in need of that support and their families that are in need of that support get that in a timely fashion. But it is worth noting that we are seeing an increasing number of child protection conferences, and as you'll see later on, that has led to an increase in number of children subject to a child protection plan. So next, moving on to children subject to a child protection plan. So that's increased over the quarter, and in August and September it was at 490. In December it's since increased to 500. If you look back comparing September 2021 with September 2020, there's a 10.6% increase in child protection plans. Over the same period, the number on child in need plans is reduced by 8.3%. So some of those children that were on child in need plans have been stepped up to child protection plans, as well as new children coming into the system. The only caveat I want to put on that is even 500, while it's increasing for Hertfordshire, it is still one of the lowest rates in the country, and that's mostly to do with the work of the family safeguarding and how that works to support children and their families. So while it's going up for Hertfordshire, and it still is continuing on that trajectory upwards, if we compare that to the national picture, we still would be in the top 10 lowest in the country for child protection plans. Next is the number of children subject to a child protection plan for a second or subsequent time. So those who were at the previous panel I presented remember that this has been going up for quite a few months, and the reasoning behind that we believed was around during the pandemic, the level of support that families would have received, not just from our partners within the community, but also within families during lockdown, has caused some families to come back onto child protection plans. The good news is that actually it's now starting to go on a downward trajectory, and it's starting to return back to, it's not quite back at where it should be, but it's going in the right direction. So you see in September it reduced to 23.4%. In December, it's since actually reduced to 20.5%, and those within 2 years have reduced down to 9.1%. So you see, still not back at where it was back in September 2020, but it is going in the right direction, and it is a consistent reduction. And it will take some time, because the way this measure is calculated, it's looking back at a 12-month period. So it won't just drop off, it will be a gradual decline, but it is month on month going in the right direction, which is good. Next, looking at children looked after numbers, obviously we've had some more discussion about the increase in children looked after numbers. So at the end of September, the number of children looked after increased to 997. It's 914 children looked after from Hertfordshire, and 83 additional unaccompanied asylum seeking children. Numbers since have gone up to 1,024 in December, and that also includes the number of unaccompanied asylum seeking increasing to 107. We expect the numbers of unaccompanied asylum seeking children to continue to increase as part of the national transfer scheme, where we're taking in young people from other local authorities who've got more than their threshold of unaccompanied asylum seeking children. And just to sort of give you a picture, it's around the 180 mark would be when we would be deemed to have hit our threshold to say we can't take any more unaccompanied asylum seeking children. So we're quite a way off that. And certainly the national rhetoric seems to be that there's more pressure on those authorities with less children to take more children in. So we expect that number will increase. But the bit that obviously we're focusing on is the Hertfordshire children looked after, and how we're going to actually reduce those. And just to sort of note that a lot of that is to do with less children leaving care rather than more children coming into care. So the children that come in are actually in care for longer than they would have been before the pandemic. And that's caused the number of children looked after to increase. And there's lots of plans in motion, which Joe can talk to later if needed, around how we're going to reduce those numbers. Next, looking at children looked after with 3 or more placements. At the end of September, it was 8.9% of our children looked after had 3 or more placements. If we look back historically, before the pandemic, actually that number was about 12%. It had been for a long time. A lot of work and investments gone into this area to improve the stability of placements for our children looked after. And one of the things that happened that was positive during the pandemic actually is that we managed to improve our stability of our children looked after, and that has continued throughout actually. And the latest figures we've got actually is it's gone back down to 8.3% in December. So I'm very confident that come the end of the year that we'll be well within that 10% target for our children looked after with 3 or more placements. Just in our other measure about stability of our children looked after is the long-term stability measure, and what that looks at is of all of our children who've been in care for more than 2.5 years, how many of them have been in the same placement for the last 2 years, and that's increased from 73.8% up to 76%. It's gone back down in December to 73.1%. But generally anything above 70% is really good. And what we'd never expect that to be 100%, because not all of these moves are necessarily negative. Some of our children who've been in care for a long time, when they turn 16, they might want to move into semi-independent accommodation to prepare themselves for adulthood. So we would never expect that figure to be 100%, just so you know. Next, one of the big areas that have been affected by the pandemic is the numbers of children exiting care via adoption, special guardianship order. You see back in September 2020, 6.1% of our children were exiting care via adoption. That's actually increased to 8.3%, but it's still not back to that pre-pandemic level. And for those with a special guardianship order, it's actually slightly reduced. That's gone down to 8.6%, and still not back at the levels where we would expect it to have been. before the pandemic, and particularly with the adoption, a lot of that is down to delays with the courts, actually possibly SGOs as well, as the courts need to prioritise the safety of children and young people. So they're prioritising cases about sort of care orders and bringing children into care rather than adoption orders and SGOs. We do have about 60 children that are looked after that have a placement order. So they're children that have been matched to a family and they're due to be adopted. They're actually with that family, but they're still technically looked after until that final adoption hearing comes through. So they are with their adoptive family, and from the point of view of the child, they're in their family. It's just that final bit of paperwork that needs to be signed off by the courts, and there's a lot of delays around that. And the next is looking at care leavers aged 17 to 21 in education, employment and training. You remember this was one of the key areas we were concerned around, the impact on the wider economy and how that would affect our vulnerable children and young people in education, employment and training. The good news is actually that this number has actually increased, so up to 56.7%. It's gone down slightly to 55% in December, but if you compare it with December in 2020, it was 53.1%, so it's still an improvement on that. And the numbers do always drop a little bit in December. This tends to be a seasonal measure, as we tend to have more young people sort of enrolled in courses in September, and inevitably some of them will drop out of those courses, a small proportion throughout the year, so which will cause that number to drop. So generally sort of September is the high point for this measure, but it doesn't seem that sort of impact at the moment anyway on the economy around the pandemic has affected the employment, education and training of our vulnerable young people that are children looked after and care leavers. And that's everything from me, but obviously if there's any other areas within the report you want to highlight, please feel free to, or if you've got any questions on any of the areas that I have highlighted.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Paul. I know, Mark Watkin, I know that you have a question, and Nigel Bell. Then Nigel Bell. So Mark.
You certainly caught me on the hop there. I was
okay. I'll come back to you.
Stage. Yes, if you wouldn't mind, just for a second.
Yeah, sure.
I know what I want to ask, but actually I can ask it. I'm not going to spend too long. And it's really the children looked after with 3 placements. And I just wanted really to get Paul's comments, because it turns out that this is both a good news story and a slightly unexpected consequence story, because my understanding is because we're getting greater stability, we're having more problem in placing children with foster carers who don't really want to upset the apple cart, if I can use that term, and that's a very coarse way of describing it. And I just wondered, are we picking that one up? And Marion's going to answer, I can see. And the other one is this whole question of adoption versus special guardianship orders. I notice now the balance is swinging back towards adoption. We're still in the 4th quartile of national of local authorities nationally. So why is it that we don't seem? Is it our courts? Is it just the way that we're addressing it? I know it's a hugely complex question, but I'm going to challenge it, because when we're in the 4th quartile, it's got to be asked. So at least a summary answer at this point from either you or Marion or somebody would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Marion?
So Mark is absolutely right in that we've been doing a very big piece of work on improving placement stability and really supporting children in placement. And what we believe is that an unintended consequence of that has been a reduction in the number of children placed with Hertfordshire foster carers. So we've been looking at why the number of children with Hertfordshire foster carers has gone down, despite the really positive recruitment activity. And there are all sorts of reasons associated with COVID, but there is also the fact that sometimes when a foster carer is approved for 2 children, If they have one child in placement and that placement is looking wobbly because of the needs of the child, we haven't put a second child into the placement. So that's a bit of a perverse consequence. But the very positive thing is that our number of children with Hertfordshire foster carers over the last couple of months has gone up. So we believe that we've turned a corner on that reduction. And the second question, we're fourth quartile against previous year's figures. So what we know from talking to colleagues in other local authorities is that they too have experienced. Are you going to correct me, Paul?
I'm just going to say yes, and they've since published the latest data, and like Marion was probably about to say, is that the whole national picture is that the number of adoptions has dropped throughout the country, and we're now actually third quartile.
Good. Carry on, Marion.
Well, that's all I was going to say, really. Everybody has had that difficulty with the courts, and I think having 60 children waiting for that adoption order, but as Paul says, living with their adoptive family is a really good news story once those orders get through.
Yeah, 60 is a tremendous number, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just one question I wanted to clarify, Terry. I noticed that the balance between SGOs and adoption seems to be swinging back towards adoption. And I wanted to comment on that, if I may, but I'm delighted to hear that we've now moved to third quartile. Maybe by the end of the meeting, we'll be in our second quartile. Who knows?
I think that is a blip, Mark. I think we've reached a point in this country where the courts and social workers very often are looking to place children with their extended family wherever possible, and adoption is on the decrease comparatively. So I think that what we will see is those SGO numbers going back up over the adoption numbers.
Thank you, that's fine, thank you.
Okay, lovely, thank you, Mark. Nigel.
Thank you, Chair, and I won't necessarily go right through the list, as Mark said, but can I go back to 611 and 72? Or, obviously 611 was looking at EHCPs who were neat, slightly worse, and 72 referrals to children's social care per 10,000. I don't know if Paul can comment on.
So can we keep the EHCP questions until the next, whatever, number 5, item 5, because Paul might not be prepared for that because he was leaving EHCPs to David. And so what was the other one? I forgot.
Sorry, 72 were looked like slightly worse than the figure. The referrals to children's social care per 10,000.
Yeah, so the referrals have continued to increase since the schools returned in March 2021. It's about 20% higher than the pre-pandemic, and so just to give the historical context behind that, actually Hertfordshire was going down every year before the pandemic between 3 and 5% as we were supporting more and more families through early help, and it is just the more complex cases that are coming through, and they are having to be passed through to children's social care, which is leading to that increase. Not for minuting, but the early indications are from January that it seems to be returning closer back to normal. But I don't like to comment on just 1 month's worth of data because sometimes there's a blip, particularly if it's things like after Christmas. So I probably wouldn't want to say until we've got sort of February and March data. But the early indications are that it may be starting to return back to normal levels.
Okay, and is that with some of the extra measures that have been put in, or not really? You're just saying, well, it's now.
I think it was a sort of a bulge of families that didn't get the support they needed during the pandemic because they weren't seen by the children, weren't seen by their schools particularly, and eventually that in theory should move through, and will have helped those children and families, and then the numbers should return to normal. That's what I'm hoping anyway. But obviously there might be some wider societal issues that have come out from the pandemic that might cause it to continue to be an increase. But if it is starting to go back down, that would be my hypothesis at this moment.
Okay. Hopefully that'll be watched then. Thank you.
So, Elle, can I ask Elle just to comment, who's our new Director of Safeguarding? Elle?
Morning, everyone. Yeah, so just to build on what Paul was saying, our hypothesis and certainly what we're seeing in terms of children and families presenting to children's social care is that children and families have got more acuity and complexity to their need, which is why they're coming straight into children's social care. And you'll remember in Paul's presentation that he spoke about the level of work coming into our early help service having flattened out. And so our hypothesis is actually that the needs of some of these children and families that are coming through as additional referrals to social care are beyond the level of intervention that they could safely be provided by our early help services. And there's a range of reasons for that acuity and complexity. So as Paul mentioned, that continued level of referral from police around domestic abuse has been a factor, but there's also been a number of factors arising from the pandemic that have impacted families. So it isn't just about children having periods of time away from school, but it's also during some of the more severe times in the lockdown. Families weren't able to get support from their community, go to parent and toddler groups. They weren't necessarily able to draw in the support of grandparents and aunts and uncles. So there's a whole range of reasons why that support hasn't been available to families. And then in addition, there's been some other unintended consequences from the pandemic that have increased stresses in families, such as people being furloughed or not being able to work. So there's been pressure on finances, there's been pressure on relationships, and all of that has contributed to that increased complexity and acuity that we're seeing, that we think has underpinned that increase in referrals into children's social care.
Okay, we'll note that. Thank you.
Is that okay? Thank you very much, Nigel.
Yeah, thank you.
Mark Mills-Bishop, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Paul, for your report. I wanted to have a look at the not in education, employment or training under item 9. Are you able to drill down further in terms of across the area of Hertfordshire, you know, where there is good practice, bad practice, good and bad, that can be fed into the action plan, as to where there can be improvement, where areas are, as I say, were good or others may be bad, and as to, you know, the reason to understand why there are those type of variation. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, so we can definitely do we can look at it by district and see what the differences are. I suppose the caveat I would put on that is that there might be huge differences between the districts, and that's not necessarily down to how well particular areas work, but more the demographics around those areas. So some areas have a lot more deprivation than other areas, but you can certainly look at how they've improved over a period of time using sort of, you know, maybe 2 or 3 years ago as a baseline and looking at where it's gone from there. But I'd be conscious to say that sort of pick one district to say being better than another district, because potentially it is probably down to sort of societal issues and deprivation within those areas.
But where there are good practices, Paul, you can feed those into the action plan, can you not?
Yeah, so I'll go back and I'll speak to the team that deal with that, and I'll see what I'm sure. I know they do have that information around the sort of areas, so they may be able to share some information around best practice in particular areas.
All right.
Yeah, I think that type of information, Mark, is fed into Terry Durris's portfolio under skills, where you've got the the new strategy for skills strategy, indeed, where youth services feeds into that. I think I'm correct in saying that's where it's falling now. So we're probably not hearing much about it here, but in the education, libraries and localism panel, I think that's where that's heard. So, but anyway, Paul can feed that back for us. Thank you. Anthony.
Thank you, Teresa. Just a question relating to 10.4, which is the vacancy rates in residential accommodation, where there is an indication that actually the vacancy rates have gone down in very recent months, having peaked. But we're given a figure that just says the vacancy rate is currently 35, and I wonder if Paul could just contextualise that and give us just a rough idea. Is that's 35 out of how many, so that one gets a feel for the scale of the problem that we have here, which we obviously talked about before.
So I believe we've got about 105 staff working in residential care. So I'd have to go back and double check the figures, but presuming if you add the 35 to the 105 or so, then there must be 140 total positions. But I'll have to go back and double check that with a colleague in HR, if that's okay. That's Marion Scott.
Yeah, that's
Marion Scott.
I think we've got 169 staff currently working, so that would take it closer to 200 as a grand total. We've just been counting our staff because of additional recognition that we want to give them because of the way that they've all gone above and beyond during COVID, where we had members of staff moving in with children. We had staff moving from one unit to another. We had staff taking children to other provision. So, yeah, we're looking at how we recognise that for our staff. But yeah, we're closer to 200 in total, and that does include several cooks and cleaners who are as important to the unit as some of the care staff.
Yeah, actually probably more important, young people and stomachs. So Anthony, are you okay with that? No, okay.
I mean, yes, we've
yeah, okay,
off and on.
Yeah.
With absolutely right that we're trying to accommodate more of the young people in county, and therefore keeping a focus on what recruitment is like. Because clearly, that's 1 in 6. That's for a staff, I don't know what the average staffing is in a house. That could be quite a big proportion, and one knows that when there are vacancies, then that's an additional burden to those who are already working there. And there is the reference in the COVID section in 10.4 about just how hard life has been for many of those people working in those extraordinarily important positions. Thank you.
Marion, do you want to comment any more or not?
I think I'd only reiterate what was said earlier, that we are doing everything that we can to recruit our children's homes. It is a very challenging job, and the academy that we've set up is the first in the country. We've just recruited 6 people. They're people who've got some form of youth work experience, but they haven't got residential experience. And what we realise when we're talking about the increased acuity and complexity of need, we're also talking about the children that we're looking after in our own children's homes. And what we've seen is some relatively inexperienced staff going in and deciding very quickly that this is not the job for them. So having the academy and having them working as extra additional members of staff in the units, having them spending days in the homes and then days doing training is a new way of trying to do it and trying to ease them in and trying to give them time to build up the skills. And we're really hopeful about it in terms of producing that workforce for the future.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that again, this is a national problem. It's not just Hertfordshire. And I'm hopeful this will be picked up on the social care review again, coming out late spring, early summer, hopefully. So, and again, I've been feeding into that. So Hertfordshire's given some very good evidence, can I say, into that review. Right, I have Fiona Thompson, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I wanted to just ask about, it was item 8, child protection. Obviously, I note the increase by, is it 10% increase compared to September last year in the number of children with child protection plans. Obviously, that's a concerning increase. And as a relatively new member to this panel, could you just explain how long a child protection plan lasts for? And if this trend continues, are you confident you have the resource to be able to manage the increase, or can anything more be done, or what more can be done to try and manage the number of protection plans? Thank you.
Thanks. I'll ask Elle to come in there if I might, Paul, if that's all right. Elle.
Thank you, Chair. So if I could take your questions in the other way round, really. So if I can just talk about what we're doing already to work with families and to support families in a way that they don't need to have a child protection plan. So in Hertfordshire, we have got the family safeguarding model, which is an evaluated and nationally recognised way of working alongside children and families with a multidisciplinary team and with our multi-agency partners, so that we are intervening in a very skilled and planned way using motivational interviewing approaches to help families to make the changes that they need to be able to safely care for their children. And we're continuing to make sure that our staff teams are well supported and are well trained and qualified to be able to undertake that very skilled and complex work with families, so that we reduce risk and we reduce the need for child protection plans. The second part of your question was around how long do those plans last for, and there isn't one fixed answer in terms of how long plans last for. So children will be made subject to a child protection plan where the professional network and the social worker considers that they are at risk of suffering significant harm. Those child protection conferences as a multi-agency group will then develop a plan of action that the multi-agency group and the social worker and the family will agree to complete, and those actions are focused on helping to reduce risk and helping families to make the changes that they need to safely care for their children. Some families make those changes very quickly, and by the time of the first review conference that we hold at a 3-month point, they may well no longer need a child protection plan. They might need some ongoing support, but they might not need a child protection plan. Many of our families actually have very complex and long-standing difficulties that won't necessarily resolve in a 3-month period of time, and they may need intensive support and child protection planning for 6 or 12 or 18 months. But we have regular child protection review conferences where the agencies involved come together with the family to review what the situation is for the child, what the risks are for the child, and whether a child protection plan is still needed.
And if I may come back to just about managing the ongoing, if the trend continues to increase, and obviously we know staffing has been a challenge, just about how you're going to manage that.
So we are carefully looking at all of the performance information month by month, and as Paul has mentioned, sometimes that is demonstrating that there's an increase. Sometimes we will have some information to suggest that things are changing, or the level of need is starting to return to pre-pandemic levels. As it stands at the moment, we don't know exactly how that is going to look in the next couple of months, but we are our hypothesis at the moment is that this is as a result of the impact of COVID, and that we don't think that it will last forever. So there is at this point a view that we need to ride out the current pressure that we've got on services. Clearly, if the information that we've got about the number of children and families requiring services were to continue at this level for a particular point, for an extended period of time, then as a service we would need to look at how we realigned our resources to be able to meet that that continued increased need. But I think it's too early to say that that's the position that we're in right now.
Okay, thank you very much, Elle. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Elle. Can I just also add, we're always constantly reviewing our family safeguarding model. So we're looking at how we might improve it, shall I say, and that's something for forthcoming later in the year. But, you know, we're always looking to update us. As Joe said earlier, we're always willing to learn from other authorities so that we can bring that best practice back to Hertfordshire.
Thank you.
So thank you for that. So we are now at the recommendations, where in 4.1 it would be, wouldn't it? The panel is asked to scrutinise current performance and comment on any areas of improvement or interest. And I think we've done that, but could I ask members to signify whether they agree or disagree? Great. So yeah, that's going to go through fine, I think. Paul, thank you very much for your input as ever. Really useful. And right, so we're now moving on to item 5. What I'm going to recommend at this point is, as it's just gone 11, is that we take a 5-6 minute break, comfort break, and come back at what should we say, 11:12. And can I also suggest to members that I see if I can bring forward the Julie Reddish paper on short breaks, and then we can run through, if everybody's all right with that, go through short breaks, and then we'll do EHCP performance and then the motions after that. Is that okay? Can you shout if you're not okay with that, please? I'm hearing that's all right. So officers, could I just ask you to make sure that when we come back that Julie Reddish is ready to present? Thank you very much. Okay, so see Welcome back, everybody. Thank you, Julie, for jumping up the list. That's really helpful. Thank you very much indeed. Julie Reddish is a senior commissioning manager in the council with special responsibility around SEND, and she's going to talk to you about overnight short breaks. Just to be clear, is that Julie's really brought this here for information, because we know members are really interested, because this commissioning this particular service is delegated to officers, but I know how important short breaks are to families with children with special needs. So Julie, thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to panel this morning. The reason why I'm here, is Teresa has highlighted, is I'm here to update the panel on the recommissioning of overnight short breaks, and to sort of say, under the Constitution, the tender was awarded as an officer decision, but obviously I'm here today to provide you with the information. So at the moment, we currently commission 3 settings across Hertfordshire, which involves 2 providers, which is Action for Children operating 2 provisions and Jubilee House Trust operating 1 provision. So why did we go out to retender? What we wanted to do was provide a consistent and uniform offer across Hertfordshire, and we wanted to also ensure that we met procurement regulations. But most importantly, we wanted to work with our parents and carers in developing a new model, which helped develop the service specification. And we were also able to include feedback from the public consultation. So the outcome of the tender has resulted in Action for Children and Jubilee still continuing to run overnight short breaks provisions. However, there has been a change at the Pines in Hertford, which will now be operated by Jubilee House Trust and not Action for Children. So our next steps in the work that we're doing is to work with Jubilee House Trust and Action for Children to ensure the mobilisation of the Pines, which involves the 2p of staff and the re-registration of the setting with Ofsted. So we're working hard with them at the moment to ensure that all happens for this to come into effect from the 1st of April. We're also working with joint comms for parents and carers, and that we've also involved HPCI in those communications, and the intention is for those comms to go out this week. And we're just having that final sign off. We're also looking at, across all 3 settings, of embedding the new service specification, and it includes some quite innovative ideas from providers, which we're looking at introducing a electronic booking system for parents, so they'll be able to actually book their overnights online, almost like a hotel booking. So they're being developed and tested as we speak. We're also looking at building on further add-on services such as short breaks local offer, and also enabling families to actually purchase further provision using their direct payments. We do feel that the decision is a safe decision for the local authority. We have 2 providers that have a very good, strong track record, have worked with Hertfordshire for a number of years, and both providers either have good or outstanding Ofsted. So we're in a good position to start this new service come April this year. Obviously, I'm happy to take any questions now if anyone's got any questions.
Thanks, Julie. So Mark Watkin, please.
Thank you very much, Terry, and thank you very much, Julie. Some of us who've been on this panel for a number of years will remember the anguish and the worry that affected so many families whose children were in the Nascot Lawn overnight provision, which was provided, of course, by the local CCG, rather may be wrong about the CCG, but one of the local health service anyway, and which actually I'm proud to say has now in my division been changed into the Centre for MenCap for South West Hertfordshire, and indeed another charity as well. So it's still going to be used as a building of value to the community. But my point really is the biggest concern around the closure of Nascot Lawn was about the provision of adequate medical support for those children with greatest need. And there was just real worry about the ability of the providers of the three other care respite centres to be able to meet that need and supply it. So I'd like some reassurance, if possible, about that. Secondly, we've talked a lot about staffing issues in other areas. Has this been an impact as far as the short stay homes are concerned? And finally, I've noted that the total budget has been reduced by £150,000 with the removal of the £350,000 transition support from the health authorities, to be replaced by, I think, is 200,000 as their contribution. What does this mean in terms of impact to the service delivery and to, what we can offer those children? Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. So I'll go through each question in turn. So with regards to the health question about the service being able to meet children with complex health needs, work has been underway for the last two years plus with regards to the CCGs in ensuring that they provide a county-wide complex health training system for our carers. And that still will continue under the new arrangement. We're working with the CCGs continuously to improve that offer, and we've now been able to provide a county-wide offer that is the same across both East and North and West Hertfordshire. So it's the same offer where carers will be offered the training on an individual case by case child basis to ensure they can provide the appropriate care for that child. And in addition, those carers will be signed off as deemed competent to be able to provide that whatever care that is regarding health to that individual child. So it is individually child-led. So actually there is no change there. In fact, to this more of a county-wide same offer. With regards to staffing levels, I have to be honest, yes, all three facilities are experiencing some staffing concerns at the moment. We do have some vacancies in the homes. Having said that, we are enabling to be able to carry out all our visits overnight. That has included some members of staff having to do further shifts, and we are having to work with some agency staff currently, although those agency staff are vetted by the overnight short breaks providers, and they're ones that they would generally use rather than just bringing in other outside agencies. So that's where we are at the moment with staffing. And with regards to the budget reduction, yes, we were aware of this when we went out to tender, and we've managed that within the service specification that we went out to bid for. We are tackling that by looking at improved staffing ratios. We're also looking at that by the efficiencies within the new service specification. What we're asking for is to ensure that each of the provisions operate a minimum occupancy level of 85%, and that will come live as of April. We're also looking at the emergency provision that is being delivered by the settings under the current arrangements, and that will fall outside of this budget. So the budget envelope will actually be solely for overnight short breaks provision, and any emergencies will be picked up outside of the budget. So we're needing to ensure that we have tight budget control on that. So we're actually using the overnight short breaks budget just for overnights and not for emergencies. And my team at the moment is currently developing a series of monitoring documentation so that we've got these tools in hand to actually be able to manage that. We will obviously throughout the whole of the contract be monitoring this closely, and we're reviewing this, and obviously be looking at what the pressures will be on this budget, and we'll be updating management accordingly.
Can I just ask one follow-on, if I may, Terry?
Yes.
I mean, the whole issue around when Nascot Lawn closed was there was a sense among lots of families that it was done to them rather than done with them. That may or may not be fair, but it was a real sense at the time that they didn't feel they had their chance to be involved. Can Julie give me complete reassurance that in this reprovisioning, families of children with SEND, i.e. the people who be using this service, have had a very close involvement in these decisions and have helped to inform the decision?
Absolutely, Mark. I mean, before we even went out to tender, when we were actually developing the service specification, we ran a number of workshops with parents. We had targeted sessions with parents where officers actually visited the overnight short breaks provisions to meet with parents to actually seek their feedback so that we could actually build that into the service specification going forward. And also we've had the consultation, the formal consultation. I'm working with HPCI and Carers in Hearts in the development of the formal service specification, and they've been actively involved in the whole tender process and decision making.
Okay.
Thank you, that's fine. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. So I've got Nigel Bell, Nigel, then Paula, then Seamus. So Nigel.
Thank you, Chair, and certainly Mark has covered initially what I would have said about Nascot Lawn. Obviously, I don't necessarily want to go back over the old campaigns, but even earlier than that, I would have obviously originally liked to, and certainly would still like to have seen us looking at 4 sites here today. Anyway, we've gone beyond that, and let's hope that's something for the future. But I am concerned after obviously hearing what Julie says about the fact that there's only 124,000 hours of provision. So clearly there was less provision. I know I did raise this with Joe in our briefing, but so I don't know if you can comment on the fact that there is less provision overall. Again, I note what Mark quite rightly has said about has there been the proper consultation, or do parents feel that there's better proper consultation? I hope there has been. And the other thing is obviously certainly it's a while since I went to West Hyde in the past, but it's talking about you know, the Jubilee House and the Jubilee Trust that looked as if you wanted to offer all 3 sites to the Jubilee Home Trust. So I just wondered, I realise, I presume that's down to funding and the criteria. Could you just comment a bit more on that again, as to why all 3 sites you couldn't offer to the Jubilee Trust? I'll leave it at there for now. If you could just come back on that.
Absolutely.
And also, sorry, one other key point that I did also raise with Joe was the fact that there will be at least an emergency bed at all 3 sites. So does this take into account, obviously, the need for this from across the county, thinking of where they are geographically, and obviously with West Hyde being a long way out in the west, which we certainly need, but will that emergency bed geographically, do we still maybe need another site, or is that enough? Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. So with respect to the hours, we've got to bear in mind that we're working on a very old service specification. So actually the current, that service specification was actually with a staffing ratio of 3 children to 1 member of staff. With the new service specification, we've modelled it up at 1 member of staff to 1 child, which is looking at taking on board the complexity of children coming through overnight short breaks. As a result of that, over the last few years, in order for us to manage the books, for a better word, and ensure that the providers are being paid appropriately, we've had to actually manage it by providers having to pull down further hours to pay for the additional staff that they've had to put on board, because that service specification was out of date. So the new service specification is a lot more reflective of what the current environment is, where most children do have staffing of 1-to-1. So we'll be able to record that as the hours that they're doing, rather than actually managing it by calling down further hours for each child to cover the staffing. So we're actually looking at it being a more realistic service spec that the providers will be working towards. The question around a Jubilee House, so yes, by undergoing the tender evaluation, Jubilee House did actually come in with the scores on the doors, for a better word, being awarded all 3 lots. The decision not to award one of the lots to Jubilee House was made on a financial decision and advice that came through our finance and procurement team due to the financial threshold of Jubilee not having enough reserves to be able to operate all 3 units, and it was deemed as a risk to the local authority to do that. So the commissioning team made the decision at that point, taking on board that advice and awarding one of the lots to Action for Children. Advice was sought on which lot that should be, and it was made on a business decision to the local authority. So hence the Pines went to Jubilee for geographical reasons more than anything else, where they could actually benefit from the economies of scale of having 2 units relatively close by, one being based in Welwyn Garden City and one being in Hertford. The question regarding emergency beds, it's been quite a difficult time to be able to analyse exactly what emergency beds we need going forward. Through COVID, particularly the first year, so 2020, overnight short breaks experienced a lot of emergencies coming into the system, and a lot of that was due to placement breakdown that came about because of COVID. For example, we had one young man that actually stayed at West Hyde in the new extension for 3+ months. So it was actually what I'd call a long-term emergency. Prior to COVID, we had a gentle trickle of emergencies coming and going. So we're needing to actually monitor exactly going forward what emergencies we will need to help send children if there is placement breakdown, or if there is circumstances why they need a short emergency. So that's something that we will be monitoring, but I have to emphasise again, that is almost like the pay-as-you-go aspect to the contract. It falls outside of this budget. It will be picked up on a pay-as-you-go basis, and we will need to manage that with our providers to see what demands going forward are, and linking in also with the CLA sufficiency side of things, because obviously they are providing emergency and provision as well. So that aspect of the contract will be under review as we go. Does that help, Nigel, with your question?
Can I just bring Marion in, Nigel?
Okay.
Marion's put her hand up. Thanks.
I just wanted to add very quickly that before this contract, we had no official emergency beds. So what we used to do was we used to ask West Hyde, or the Pines, or Jubilee, if they would do us a favour and look after a child. For example, as Julie said, where a placement broke down. So we had no emergency beds for disabled children who needed a bed in a crisis. So this is a really positive move. It's a real it's a really positive development that they've all agreed that they will deliver that for us. And as Julie says, we don't know how much we'll need it, but what we have seen is we've seen residential schools closed down by Ofsted. We've seen all sorts of difficulties where children have needed these beds. And then just to go back to that first point, what Julie was explaining was that sometimes one child would look like they were in receipt of 21 hours of care for a 7-hour stay. And what we're going to be doing now is recording it much more accurately. So we don't anticipate any real reduction in hours.
All right. Okay.
Is that right, Nigel?
All right. Thanks on that. And on the emergency beds, you're saying we're in a better position, in quote, well, obviously, but then we need to monitor what happens in the next 6 months as we go, and we may have to look again. All right. Thank you.
Okay, lovely. Thanks, Nigel. Paula.
Thank you, Chair. Very positive things are coming out of this. The fact that we now have emergency beds, which we didn't have before, which must be very useful for people to know exactly where they can put children when those emergencies arise. Also very pleased to hear that we're going on electronic bookings, because as a very busy carer or parent, to be able to just look online, yes, there's a space here, I can arrange my life around that, etc., rather than being on a phone and having lots of different dates. I can imagine that is a real improvement. And the fact that we're going to have 85% of these facilities with children in, so we're using them to the best full potential, which is obviously really good. So I'm really pleased with that. And also that the one in West Hyde, of course, who's in my division, so I know it well, and beautiful place, lovely setting, really nice place for children to go and spend some relief. Just a couple of questions. One is just because I'm new at this, I don't quite understand, are two operators running these places when we've got the bids coming in from the Jubilee House Trust and the other one? I'm not quite sure how that works, if somebody could explain that. And then I did see somewhere, which I'm trying to find now, but this is available for children who live in Hertfordshire or have a GP in Hertfordshire. How do we manage that? You know, I don't want to be awful, but we do need the money for our children, that people aren't having a registered GP in Hertfordshire, living over the border and maybe accessing the facilities. Could somebody answer those for me, please? Thank you.
So, Paula, just to explain with regards to the tender process, so when we went out to tender at that point, we invited a number of organisations. So we actually advertised that on our Supply Hertfordshire website, which actually invites numerous organisations to bid for the overnight short breaks contracts. So we broke them into 3 lots: the Hertford one, the Welwyn Garden City, and obviously the Rickmansworth sites, and invited SEND providers to be able to bid for those. We actually only received 2 bids for the tender, which were from the current providers, Action for Children and the Pines and Jubilee House. During the process, we actually evaluate the tenders looking at a cost and quality. And there's an evaluation panel that's made up of key stakeholders and professionals within the local authority, parents, carers, and then it undergoes a moderation panel where all parties actually explain why they are giving scores to particular questions. So going through that transparent process, then we're able to evaluate the bids, taking into account the price and quality. We also sought feedback from our young commissioners as well, so that young people had input into the tender process, and from there the scores on the doors will actually then relate to who we award. And as I previously said, we were unable to award all to Jubilee because of the financial risk factor. So with regards to living in Herts and a GP, that is only one of the criteria to be able to access an overnight short breaks. The child is actually undergoes a social care assessment, and obviously from there a panel will decide on how many nights of overnight short breaks that child can receive. To this date, I haven't yet come across a child in receipt of a Hertfordshire GP, but you know, playing the system, if you like, to be able to access it, we haven't come across that, and that's something that we would monitor and keep an eye out for. So that's part of our eligibility checking.
Thank you. It's just obviously I know the West Hyde, we're right on the border with Bucks and Hillingdon, so I just wanted to check that that wasn't happening at all.
And we have close relationships with those local authorities anyway, so we would be able to look at that.
Okay, thanks, Paula. Seamus.
Yeah, thank you. And I too am not going a few words here. I'm acting as a substitute today, so I'm not going to make a great big long speech, but I just thought I'd come in and say well done to everyone. You know, particularly in relation to this particular item. I've actually been there before in the past, many years ago. Julie, you might remember that I was involved in Nascot Lawn on the scrutiny, and it's fair to say that all residents and workers at the time were involved in that, and it was a very I think I personally believed it was the right decision was got to at the end of the day. We won't go into that again, but moving forward though, what great news. You know, what great news this particular update is bringing us. And so well done to everyone. And I sit and be watching from the sidelines with great interest. Thank you.
Thanks, Seamus, appreciated. Mark, did you want to come back?
It's a very quick one, Terry, but just reflecting on the move away from Nascot Lawn. One of the challenges was making sure the accommodation could meet the needs of the children, particularly those with very demanding needs, and the room around the bed and all this. I know this is quite a major question. So I just wanted to be sure, are we confident now that we have the right accommodation with the right facilities to meet the needs of the children that we want to be able to put into those homes?
Absolutely, yes, we have done quite a bit of work on the accommodations to ensure that we have the necessary equipment and also the room to be able to do that. One of the biggest issues was actually West Hyde, if everyone recalls, because of the size of the bedrooms, and we've now got a lovely 2-bedroom extension to West Hyde with a purpose-built very large bathroom, and so that has been fantastic for the provider to be able to provide the appropriate care for the children there. And without selling it too much, if you do get the opportunity to visit it, you will see that it provides the necessary space that is required.
Thank you. I'd love to. I remember going down there, I think, when it had just opened, that extension, and I agree with you. It's a gorgeous site and it was very well provided for. I just wanted to be reassured that we were now confident that we had everything we need in all the various homes. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I just make the point that I'm very grateful to both Jubilee House and Action for Children for the help and assistance they've given working with the County Council over the last 4 or 5 years now. Time flies, but I believe that working together with them actually has provided a very good facility for our young people, and I'm really very grateful. And as said previously, the West Hyde extension's beautiful, really is beautiful. So thank you for that. Are we any more questions? No, so we'll go to the vote, if we might, in relation to the Cabinet panel is asked to note the update of the recommissioning of the overnight short break service. All those in favour or noting that, please. Apologies, my system is really slow. So I've hopefully voted.
Rick's noted, Teresa.
Great, oh, I voted twice, there we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so that is item 6 moved up. So thank you very much, Julie, for your time. Thank you. So we now move to item 5 on the agenda. And before we sort of start off with this SEND section, although we did actually have a lot of discussion in the integrated process in part at the beginning of the meeting, I just feel that given the amount of correspondence that colleagues have been receiving recently from the SEND National Crisis Group, that I just ought to say thank you to that group for sharing their updated survey results with us. And thank you also to all the families that contributed. We're really grateful. We want to assure you that this constructive feedback will be used to help shape improvements within our SEND service. We listen to whatever parents tell us. It's no secret that there is significant pressure on the service at the moment, and that we are also working to support increased numbers of children and young people with EHCPs. We are really working hard to recruit SEND officers, an issue that is being faced nationally, and unfortunately it does take time to recruit. We've also put in place a targeted customer service for SEND that means that parents' calls are answered. We know we've got more to do. We'd like to thank all the children, young people and families for their patience and understanding while we work through these challenges. So I say that with heartfelt care, can I say, for all families with children with these complex issues. So I'd now like to ask David Butcher, who is the ISL Area Manager, County Lead for Strategy, Performance and Quality. There we are, David. That's a really long title, but welcome.
Thank you, Chair. And if I may just bring up some slides just to talk through some of those key statistics.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So like Paul in the preceding item, a number of the data points here relate either to Q2 or autumn term data. So as we go through, if there aren't updates included in the slides, I will try to talk to those as we go. And really, as ever, when presenting to panel, really helpful, I think, to start, if I may, Chair, with the update around the total number of requests for statutory education, health and care plan assessments. And I think this is very much continuing the trend that I've talked about with panel before, in terms of we are still seeing that steady increase in the numbers of requests. The chart at the top left-hand corner shows that tracking in terms of the cumulative numbers and giving us a track over 4 years now. You can see very clearly in terms of that blue line being quite noticeably ahead of where we were last year. and that representing a 16% increase. So as we were talking in the previous paper on the budget, we were talking about that sort of 15% marker in terms of activity levels overall. And I think by and large that will be a familiar trend as we work through these slides. I would just draw out, that trend upwardly has been there for some time, but particularly since July 2020, and as schools started to reopen after initial lockdown. The other point, just to emphasise, and again this was alluded to in the item on the budget earlier, a significant amount of additional funding that's gone into mainstream schools through that new high needs funding top-up mechanism, what's known colloquially as banding. And that's very much aligned with plans, and we think that will be driving some of the activity alongside that increased demand that has come from COVID. A couple of other points to draw out, I think particularly from the bottom right-hand corner here, and it's really just that point in terms of the size of Hertfordshire, and I've made this point in the panel before, when we think about absolute numbers, we're one of the very largest local authorities. So it's really helpful, as happens in social care, to do that comparison as a rate, considering the overall population. And when you do that here in terms of the request, you can see that we are ahead now of the national position, but still just slightly behind statistical neighbours. And again, I think it's really important that we're talking a lot about how we respond to a really rapid rate of increase in demand in this area. But we do need to just keep an eye when particularly thinking about things like our early intervention and targeted support, about the overall levels of support at this statutory level in Hertfordshire. Following that through, if I may, the next piece in terms of thinking about the pathways is really looking at building on those requests. How many of those are progressing to a full statutory assessment? And again, the trends that previously reported to panel, that we're seeing a slightly higher proportion of those requests being agreed has continued. So in terms of thinking about the academic year to date, we're running at that 83.5%. Whereas you can see from the previous years, we've always been around 3/4. So that's leading to a couple of things that I think are worth drawing out for panel's attention. One is that I think that does reflect some of that impact from COVID, particularly that time that children spent out of school over the last 18 months or with unusual circumstances and arrangements. And that's meant that we are seeing both from schools and within the teams reports of growing numbers of children where there's that demand for support relating to anxiety, emotional well-being, mental health and so on. So I think a lot of that can be directly attributed to those impact of lockdowns and pandemic. But I think the other thing that's is significant is it does mean in terms of the activity underway in terms of statutory assessment, there is a significantly higher demand. So it's not just the numbers of requests, but also the proportion of those that are going to assessment that's relevant when we think about capacity. That plays through in terms of just thinking about the numbers in the system. And I would just draw out here the numbers of new EHCP plans being issued in the autumn term. Again, compared to previous years, we've got quite a significant increase there. What I would want to say is where we've been talking around 15% as a benchmark for others, this increase is close to 50%. But I think a large part of that is that the numbers would have been artificially lower because of the impact of lockdown this time last year. So when we look at a like for like, it does appear significantly greater. But I think when we look at it over the course of a longer period, the whole year, we will see that settling down and probably coming in line with that 15%. But the other item I think that's really important to draw out here is the impact of that growing demand and some of the capacity pressures in terms of the timeliness of those assessments. We've often talked at panel that Hertfordshire has been an outlier here in terms of a very high number of those assessments being completed within timescales. And what we've seen during the autumn term is that performance coming very much in line with the national position. We've been fortunate that because this is an area of national pressure, the Department for Education has been working to do some benchmarking on a monthly basis. So we can say with confidence that that Hertfordshire is in line with that national performance, and also that a number of the issues that we're facing are very much being reported by many other local authorities. And I think particularly in terms of the timeliness, there are issues that we've talked about already in the course of this panel around some of the capacity within teams. But I think it's not just the statutory SEND teams and the SEND officers, it's also relating to the availability of those professional advice givers, particularly in terms of educational psychology, some of our health colleagues, but also specialist advisory teachers. So this is an area where it's not driven by any one individual factor, but a combination, I think, of both demand and pressure across the system. Moving on in terms of annual reviews, and a couple of things to draw out, because I'm conscious this has been an area that the panel has been particularly interested in over the last year. We've started to see now that the impact, I think, of working through the majority of the historic backlog. And what we talked about last time, I think, was that a number of plans that were being picked up that were already overdue was impacting on the timescales that the team was able to affect, because effectively they were already overdue as they were picked up. A lot of that work has now been resolved, and we're starting to see, I think, the real positives coming through there. That's as a consequence of the additional investment that's enabled us to put the dedicated annual review team in place. And that pilot is something that will continue in the proposals for the new model. The second thing that was introduced at the beginning of the autumn term from September was that team has been able to pick up the initial triage and processing of annual reviews as they've come in. And again, they are now holding and dealing with just over half of all of the reviews, with the more complex ones being then picked up by the ongoing area SEND teams. So that's leading to some positive pickup in terms of the timescales here. And that very much being continued, I think, as we move through the autumn term. So you should expect to see that data continuing to improve. That said, though, we know that there are a number of plans that are at the stage of being amended following a review, and they are being impacted by some of those capacity pressures in the teams in the same way that initial education, health and care plans are too. A couple more in terms of tribunals. In terms of the period through the autumn, 61 appeals lodged with the tribunal. Again, an increase on where we've been in the previous year, but in line with that overall demand increase in terms of the system. I think we've talked at panel before that whilst appeals are lodged, that doesn't necessarily mean that they will progress to a full hearing. Often the local authority is able to work closely with families to try and resolve that without the need to get to that point. And around 70% of those appeals, one way or another, are resolved before getting to hearing. The other point that just wanted to draw out really is a reminder for panel, and it's that piece that our overall rate of appeal has stayed relatively constant over the years since the reforms, whilst national comparators have come closer to us. So we are ahead of the national position in our statistical comparators, but we have stayed relatively constant in terms of our overall rate, albeit that our numbers in the system overall have increased. And the final piece I touched earlier about that piece about Hertfordshire as a large local authority. When you look at those large in terms of overall populations of local authorities, you do generally see a slightly higher appeal rate. So I think it's a piece about continuing to monitor this area, but performance remains relatively in line with what's been previously reported. A couple of slides to just try and summarise that and bring that together, Chair. One is in terms of looking at the total open caseload in terms of the statutory SEND service at present. And again, this is dated to the end of November, but the trend has continued into the new year in terms of an overall increase in education, health and care plans of around 11% to November. That will increase and bring us, when we do that full year comparison, close to the levels that have been talked about in earlier papers. But the other piece I wanted to draw attention, I think, in terms of the changes in demand, is just looking at the picture, considering the orange bar, which is open assessments as well as total plans, and just looking back at that period in January 21. So whilst we've seen some fall in the numbers of open assessment cases since the summer, that's very much following a seasonal pattern in line with academic years. So I think it's important to look back to the left-hand side of that chart, just in terms of reflecting that numbers are up almost 20% in terms of that overall volume of active new cases within the service. A couple of discussions already today in terms of the caseloads within the service, and I think it's just reflecting that piece about, given the overall growth in numbers, we have seen since 2017 that increase in caseloads. That's particularly exacerbated by, I think, any vacancy rate or long-term sickness. And whilst that is clearly mitigated where possible by the use of additional staff, as the Chair alluded at the start, that does take some time in terms of rapid response, and I know that will be picked up in the following item. But overall, that does mean the impact on caseloads, if we had every officer in and fully available, would be around 285 at present. But actually, the current caseloads, given those factors, closer to 380. Just that final point in terms of volume again, and just really trying to set it into context. Hertfordshire has seen a much more rapid rate of increase in terms of our EHCP numbers. But again, when we look at our comparators, we do see that we still don't have as many children at that statutory end as we might expect, all things being equal. Just one final bit, which I think reflecting some of that additional pressure around capacity in the system. One, building on the report that came to a previous panel, looking at complaints and compliments overall, and I think panel keen to see the ongoing inclusion here. So this is Q2 data, so it's only to the end of September. We're just waiting on the Q3 to land imminently, but you can see that significant increase in terms of complaints and representations in this space compared to previous years. And then the final piece, Chair alluded to some of that additional support that's been put in place since the last panel in terms of responding to those particular concerns about being able to contact the service and that communication, and really just reflecting that one of those key immediate responses has been from December. The customer service centre has been fielding the first line telephone calls into the service. And it was just some of the initial data that had come out at the time of putting panel papers out in terms of the impact of that. I understand that the proportion of calls answered since then is now running at around 3/4 of all calls, and around 40% of those are being resolved during that initial call by the customer service centre. So whilst that won't address all of the issues that parents in particular are contacting the service around, it hopefully represents an improvement in terms of that initial contact since the last panel. And Chair, I think that was it in terms of the highlights from the report.
Okay, thanks very much, David. Jo, do you want to add anything at this point?
Thank you, David, for the data overview. I think what we can see from the data is that the service continues to experience incredibly sort of high pressure across not just the council statutory SEND services, but also across health services, particularly as we move out of through the pandemic. And I would just draw to people's attention, although David did say it, is that actually the spike in demand that we've seen since the beginning of the pandemic pretty much mirrors the spike that we discussed earlier around the increased referrals into our social care services. And part of what we're seeing behind that is that increased complexity of need, an acute need that I think Elle was describing as she explained the pressure we're seeing on our social care front door. We're seeing that play out across the SEND system. And lastly, I would just draw to people's attention the point we were making in the discussion around the IP is that the new investment that we're seeing across SEND will do a number of things, but two key things. One is it will help build that capacity and resilience of our frontline teams. And David talked about, the impact that we're seeing across caseloads. It will take time to recruit to those staff teams. We're bringing in agency workers where we can, but we're really keen to recruit permanent staff to provide that resilience and that sort of, that known point of contact, a SEND officer that they know. So we're really working hard on that recruitment piece. And secondly, we want to think and continue to think about how we can manage or meet needs of children and young people and their families earlier on. So that whole graduated response that you've heard us talk about in previous panels, how can we make sure that children and young people have their needs met earlier on? For some children, they'll always need to progress through the statutory assessment process, but for others, we might be able to meet their needs earlier on in mainstream schools if we can get the right support in, and that's a massive focus of our current work streams. So I'll stop there because I can see there's a lot of questions and we can manage them as we go.
Yeah, thanks very much. So first question, Nigel.
Thank you, Chair. And can I just say, obviously, with your statement, I'm pleased that you did describe the feedback as constructive and that you said you will listen, and I hope you will listen to all voices. And obviously that's going to be important because clearly there are some parents who in the authority who have lost, they've lost trust in the authority. So hopefully by saying you're going to listen and be constructive and listen to all parents, that will hopefully get some of that trust back, or all of the trust back. I think a lot of the issues were there before COVID, but that's not to downplay COVID. Clearly, it's been a major part in pushing things back. So we have to take that into account. But can I thank David for his report? And I just wanted to mention some things that have already been mentioned, especially at 8/1, the end of November 21, the 9,264 children with EHCPs, and that 11% increase, which I know he mentioned. And again, what Mark mentioned at the start about that average caseload of 285 if we had a fully established service, but obviously increasing to 380 with obviously the staff turnover. I know it's been difficult, and vacancies, and obviously sickness absences. So, I understand that with the review, the extra money, which hasn't properly gone through yet. So, we need to take that into account. That has to be noted. But again, at 9/1, the fact that the complaints have increased by 61 in Q2, I think we do need to remember that. And I do need to mention, like an answer back, I know David mentioned this at 9/2 about the big issue for many parents clearly is still there about contacting and about the via phone and emails. Now, he does mention the customer service centre. This has led to, my quotes, improved responsiveness via SEND duty lines, as well as releasing some operational capacity within the service, which obviously is good. But he then says, obviously, on the 10th of January, and looking at that graph, it looked like it was 70% of calls answered. He's now saying, which obviously is high as 3/4, which I presume is 75%. And therefore, the key thing is if we get the full-time equivalent officer capacity, will that improve things by 25%? And when do we think we're going to get that? Are we saying over the next 6 months, over the next year? Obviously, if you're saying now that parents' queries either by phone or email are being answered, that 75% are being answered, which is obviously good. When do we think that we're going to get up to, say, full capacity or almost full capacity? So just a few of those points, and obviously the complaints. What are those complaints based on? That increasing the complaints to 61 in Q2. You know, what is the majority of those complaints? What are they about? That's the two main ones. And where are we going to get on the get up to maximum, or from 75% to maximum answering of parents' queries? Thank you.
So, David, can you manage those? Because Tony's not here, or Joe?
I'm happy to kick off, and then Joe, feel free to jump in. So I think caseloads would be my first comment, and we've talked in the context of the budget paper and in the financial section here that the proposed changes for the statutory SEND service leads to a 25% increase in capacity within the service. But it also includes additional investment for support that wraps around the statutory SEND service. And I think what that draws out is that it's very difficult to do some benchmarking to arrive at what a sensible caseload might be, because we know from some local authorities that have higher caseloads than that level, but overall the service is working very well. Equally, we know that there are others with a lower caseload than that, where there are a number of challenges. So I think it's probably important to think as we move to a new focus on different functional areas, that we're thinking about what is the appropriate caseload for each of those, rather than an overall. In terms of the calls answered, I think there's just a couple of pieces that would want to draw out. One is that particularly during January, there were some pressures in terms of the customer service centre themselves around staff availability and COVID, particularly through those early weeks where there were some really high sickness rates across the country, and the customer service centre experienced some of that as well. I think the other piece is that we've been training more of the customer service centre staff as that's mobilised, but initially they were generally the operators who are also taking the social care and safeguarding calls, and typically those calls were being prioritised in terms of safeguarding concerns. As we've got more available staff, that's been helping with that capacity within the customer service centre. So I think we'll never get probably to 100%, because there'll always be some calls that are started but people don't follow through. But typically, the proportions have been going up each week, all things being equal. So I suppose they would be probably my three observations in terms of a couple on caseloads, one on the duty lines. But Joe, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I think that's a fair summary in response to the question about the customer services and the calls. Your other question, Councillor Bell, was in relation to complaints and the types of themes that we're seeing through the complaints. Now, I have Jenny Newman on the call, who's our head of SEND, and she may be best placed just to very briefly touch on the types of complaints that we're seeing. So, Jenny, could I hand over to you?
Thank you.
You're on mute, Jenny.
Sorry. Afternoon, everybody. Sorry, Chair. I just wanted to say that I think in terms of the nature of the complaints we're seeing, majority of them are about process and timeliness and communication with the service. So all things and areas that we're addressing, and we are seeing people writing in because they have had the issues with not being able to contact the service in a timely way. So the majority of the complaints that we're seeing that are increasing are from parents and also from our councillors and our representatives on behalf of their constituents, asking for what progress there is in terms of their particular case. So in what we're trying to address with the service, that actually if we work in a more proactive way, we won't be spending the time having to write answers to complaints. It's going to take time for us to turn that around and see the positive. But as David said and Joe alluded to, with the customer services being the first point of contact, we really hope that we're going to make big inroads in reducing those complaints.
Okay, yeah, sorry, Chair, through you. Yeah, thank you for that explanation of what those and the process and that, and obviously we need to monitor that. But thank you for now. It just needed asking. Thank you.
Yep, no, that's fine. I'm hoping that these statistics, which will be presented to panel in a timely way, shows how we want to work transparently, and actually we're getting better at collecting data going forward. So I think this is really going to help us make sure that the SEN system is really working for the best. Fiona.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, David, for this report. I have a couple of questions. So just going back to the first slide, I think it was number 4, the narrative suggests that the new funding system could be a reason for impacting the number of requests received. Could you, as a new member to the committee, could you explain why that is the case? So that was that. Then could you explain the difference between the figures? So 405 go forward to assessment, but 413 new EHCPs were awarded. So I'm not clear why it would be a higher figure than the number who've gone forward, unless it includes some other data. And obviously I note that's a 50% increase, and it's very clear the demand on the service. Looking at the number of EHCPs determined, I think it was 40% not determined in 20 weeks. And again, one of the reasons was cited as potentially delays from partners. So NHS, EdPsych, just wondering what's been done to try and improve the response, because clearly if parents are waiting 5 months to find out if an EHCP has been awarded, that and it's longer than that, then clearly that would have an impact on what they do next in terms of going to appeal, etc. So just wondering what we're doing to encourage, I suppose, and work with partners. And then finally, just on appeals, is there a timescale for appeals to be heard? Again, I'm just thinking on the impact on parents, and something I didn't see in the report, the alternative to appeals. So good that many of the requests for appeal don't go forward, but what is the alternative? Is it mediation? And if so, how successful is that? And then the very final question, do you have a breakdown on the reasons for appeal? Is that something you ever report? Again, as a new member, it would be interesting. Thank you. Sorry, I know I've given you a lot of questions, but I've spoken with parents recently, and obviously there's lots of concern out there, and clearly we want to support you to support parents. So the more information we can have, the better, really.
Thank you. So in terms of, if I may pick up the statistical questions, and I'll pick up the funding one, but then in terms of the mitigations, I know we've got Jenny here, and I believe Sally Orr is also here, and maybe in a strong position from a commissioning perspective to talk about some of that work with partners. So thank you. In terms of the new funding, historically in Hertfordshire, we had 2 completely separate systems. We had the statutory assessment process, whether that was statements before the code changes, or since the SEND reforms, the Education, Health and Care Plan. But we didn't have individual funding or top-up funding that was directly aligned to those plans. So it was applied for a separate process that you'll hear referred to, called exceptional needs funding. And what that meant was that in some cases, so long as mainstream schools were able to access that additional funding support, they didn't necessarily, in addition to that, go down a statutory assessment route. Whereas now, because the 2 processes are much more closely aligned, there's less likelihood that you'd have one without the other. Is the short answer. If Tony would hear, he would talk much more knowledgeably about that because he's very heavily involved in leading that change. Joe, I don't know if you want to.
Can I just add to that? I mean, I think the new banding system that we brought in and implemented in September 2020 is a good thing. It's something that we consulted widely on, both with our schools, but also with our parent and carer forums and parent carers widely. And what we've done is put in place a system that clearly identifies the need of individual children, and then aligned to that what provision is needed and what funding is needed, on a graduated scale, on a banded system. So those children with higher level of need receive a higher level of provision, and alongside that a higher level of funding. And that is all about enabling children to have their needs met where possible in mainstream schools. And when we've significantly increased the amount of funding going into mainstream schools to that end. The only thing I would add is that it may well be that has in part contributed to the rate of increase in requests for EHCPs that we're seeing. But we know that rate of increase was high and increasing even prior to us introducing this new way of funding and provision. And indeed, the spike that we've seen very much does coincide with the pandemic and everything that we've discussed about increasing complexity of need that we're seeing for our children and young people. So I wouldn't want you to take from this that the new funding formula that we've put in place is the sole reason for the increase in rate. It's one part of a very complex picture.
And with just also to add, Chair, that I think that on top of that, there is a national picture of seeing children with high-level needs coming into the education system, for example, with really low levels of speech, language and communication, having been out of school for such an extended period of time. And I think that is very much the impact of the pandemic, and we are seeing that as a national issue. It's something that is discussed across the Eastern region and at national forums as very much an impact of the pandemic. And what our schools and settings are saying is they are having to manage that across the board with children who have returned to education, where they are displaying needs, the gap widening, and maybe we wouldn't have badged them as having SEND previously, but now, because of the gap, because of the time out of school, because of the lack of education during that period, they are now requesting education, health and care plans to try and narrow that gap.
So that
it's
nicely
not just a Hertfordshire problem.
No. So that nicely brings us on to the partnership part of the question. So Sally, could you respond to that part?
Thank you. Yes, and thanks, Jenny. That was a really good lead-in. The bit that I commission is the integrated therapist contract. So that's the occupational therapist and the speech and language therapy. And similarly with the increase in EHCPs, obviously that's put huge pressure on that service. In addition to that, over 60% increase in the number of EHCPs that have requested a therapy assessment. So not only have the number of assessments gone up, but more of them are asking for a therapy assessment. On top of that, in 2020, the Department of Health mandated that therapists should be redeployed to support the adult response to COVID. Plus, we had schools closures and bubbles. So really, the service paused for a lot of the time in 2020. So we're working in two parts, and Chair has already asked if I would bring a more detailed report to the next meeting of this panel about the work we're doing on it. We're doing one bit of work about COVID recovery and the therapies, and we've been working really well with the providers, Hertfordshire Community NHS Trust, who have bent over backwards to find a way to support the catch up during COVID. But on top of that, we're taking a bid to Schools Forum later in the month for additional resource, again, to increase the capacity. But we can't just say we'll go out and recruit more therapists, because there aren't therapists out there. We'll just be stealing them for other areas. So we're looking at a different way of a different model entirely, a different skills mix, different way of delivering the service. And that's the report that I'll be bringing to the next meeting.
Okay. So I didn't write down Fiona's question, sorry. So
thank you. I had a question just about the difference between the figures, the 405 going forward to assessment, but 413 actually EHCPs being awarded? There's probably a very simple explanation, but I don't know what that is.
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and the answer is it's about the way we're presenting the numbers here. So we're counting activity in the month. So as an example, if a request came in today, it would be counted as a request in the February figures, assuming it was agreed at week 6 for progressing to full assessment. That bit would be counted in the March figure, and then assuming it came to being issued as a final EHCP, that would likely to be in July, so it would be counted there. So it's the same child, but in terms of how it would show up in these numbers, that activity would mean that it would be counted once in February, once in March, once in July against the relevant lines.
So the end of year figures will give the true reflection of total numbers requested and carried forward.
Yeah, so the aggregate of the monthly totals and so it gives you a good feel. But yeah, we're sort of counting at different stages of the process. Okay,
thank you. And then just something on appeals. Is there a timescale for appeals to be heard? And does this panel ever receive a breakdown on reasons for appeal? And there was something around mediation as well I was asking about.
So on the statistics, we can certainly include some more information in future reports. But in terms of some of the detail, I'll pass to Jenny.
Yeah, I mean, there is data that we can produce and share with this panel, Chair, if that's something you'd like us to share at a later panel. But I can tell you that the majority of the appeals are that there are certain sections that you can appeal against. So you can appeal against the contents of a plan, you can appeal against the needs that are identified, and you can appeal against the placement, or you can appeal on all three. And there is now an extended appeal that can include health and social care, which the tribunal can make recommendations on. And we're seeing increasing numbers of those extended appeals in Hertfordshire. We're also seeing increasing numbers of appeals that include requests for independent placements. And we think that part of the reason for that is the demand on special school places, coupled with the increase of children who are statutory. We don't have very many refusals to assess appeals, and that's because we try and resolve those without going to appeal. Mediation is something that we always offer. We have to offer it, but we are always keen to resolve through mediation. What we see in Hertfordshire is often some of the issues that they're seeking to resolve are difficult to resolve through mediation because they are about resource, and resource is such high cost. They are often things that have to go to be looked at through tribunal. But we are developing through our new pathway review a team that will be focused on reconciliation and what's the other R, David? Reconciliation and resolution. And I always forget the two R's. And we are working very hard to make sure that in Hertfordshire we are trying to resolve before things get escalated and parents feel the need to go to appeal. We absolutely want to resolve those appeals. We've met with Sally on several occasions because we have quite a high level of appeal where parents are looking for a higher level of therapy to be specified in an EHCP. And that's another issue we're trying to tackle, because private therapists will write reports detailing a request for a very high level of provision, which won't be in line with what our NHS colleagues will determine is the need of the child. So we want to be really clear about what our offer is in Hertfordshire for those children, how we can meet the needs of those children, and to build the confidence of parents so they don't feel the need to have to go to a tribunal to get what they want to meet their children's needs.
Thank you. Just coming back on that, so clearly the working with partners, NHS colleagues and psychs is critical, isn't it? Because there could be this disparity. So a private report will suggest one thing and so there's a conflict there.
Okay, so just in relation to the reporting of the types of appeals, I think that normally comes into the annual compliments and complaints report, or half yearly. So we already report it,
Yes.
but we'll consider going forward how we do these things. We have to bear in mind that we do have a plan for introducing more supported, shall I say, special places within our own system, as we've talked about, and special schools. So one would hope over the next few years that the need, parents not being able to get what's named in their EHCP will move away. That's the, you know, that's the grand plan, and we're hopefully going to work towards that. Right, so I'm going to move on. Colleagues, can I ask if you've got lots of questions? There's quite a lot to take in, sort of 6 of them in one go. Perhaps you could break them down a bit, but let's see, because I'm probably all going to start asking the same things eventually. Helen Campbell.
Thank you very much, Chair. So I'm Helen Campbell, representing St Albans North, and my sincere apologies to the panel and officers and anybody watching. I cannot put my camera on, I'm afraid, because it is broken. My sincere apologies. Thank you very, very much for all the presentations from all of the officers. I do have a couple of questions, Teresa, which I will make brief, but before I ask them, I do just want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the hard work and the incredibly challenging circumstances within which we all know that all of the officers across the county council, but particularly the officers in this team, the circumstances within which you are working, you have my sympathies and admiration for what you're all trying to do. I want to ask about the survey and mention the survey, because I have seen a couple of references in reports, and I think it was in your notes, Chair, ahead of the panel, that the number of respondents to the survey was quite small. It was 177 at the last count that I saw, and I know that you are not trying to give the impression that you don't think those families and those children are important. I know that, but I cannot fail to mention and to acknowledge that every single one of those children matters. Every single one of those children matters. If there'd only been 10 responses to that survey, those 10 children would matter. If there'd been 1,000 responses to that survey, those 1,000 children would matter. There are parents there crying out in despair and distress, and it is difficult to read their emails. I've read every single one that I'm sure we've all received, and I will be replying individually to every single one that I've received as well. I have not yet done so, but I will be. I was waiting till after this panel. It's those children that I'm thinking of when I ask my questions. Those are the children that I've got at the forefront of my mind. David, you said that COVID was not a single factor in leading to where we are now, and I absolutely understand everything you said. There were other factors as well. Brexit, I think, is probably one of them. We know that a lot of staff have left from the health and social care sector. I know that has had an impact. We all do. We all know that. It seems to me that a lot of the impact of COVID, the COVID part of this, could have been foreseen, and I think it was foreseen. We did hear and see and read teachers, teaching professionals, SEND professionals. I've heard it from officers as well. At the beginning of the pandemic, which was now nearly 2 years ago, that this sort of thing would be a likely impact of the pandemic, that we would see children facing additional problems. We would see children who already had problems falling deeper into into difficulties. I'm not surprised that we've now got parents crying out in despair and distress, because for a child to have difficulties that are not being met for even half a year or a school year, that has an immense impact on their life chances. So I want to ask I think I'm going to direct this question to Teresa as the chair, if that's okay. Do you agree that some of this was foreseen, the impact of COVID was foreseen, and it could have been, some of it could have been planned for earlier? I don't mean implemented, because I think that would be unfair, but could have been planned for earlier. And do you acknowledge that unfortunately some of the children that we have heard about in these emails from that survey, for them it will be too late? Do you acknowledge that, and is there anything that we can say to them? Thank you.
So first of all, Helen, can I say that every one of those families that have written to us, and the ones I've received, will receive a corporate response back, and their actual concerns addressed. So just to say that. Also, I did not indicate I considered less of those that input than anybody else writing to us. So I don't know where you got that impression from. That is not what I said at the outset of this when I made another statement. People tend to read something different, which I didn't say. However, so could we have done something about the impact? As far as I'm concerned, we did what we could do with the availability of the staffing. Now, the county worked with schools, and as you know, all schools remained open for those young people, if officers put me right if I'm wrong on this, who had a need, in effect. So all our vulnerable children could go to school, so that's our children in care and those children with SEND, if their special school could stay open. And I know there were some instances around the county where that wasn't possible. So they did get that support. If parents chose not to send their children into school because of fear of infection, that is something I understand that we tried to work with, but that was another issue. The 2020 impact was enormous, I agree, but this was a new pandemic. It was killing people rapidly. And those children with health conditions were probably some of the most susceptible to the disease. And because the government, the NHS, decided to deploy frontline, I'll call them professionals because there's all sorts of health professionals to do other jobs, that is not something that this authority could manage directly. And I believe that we did the best. Now, everybody can say something in hindsight, can't they? And we can all make a political point. But my view is that we in Hertfordshire do the best we can with what we've got. And I know that the NHS colleagues and other professionals also do what they can to help our young people. So I don't think I want to say any more than that. I don't think I've missed anything. I may have done, but I don't know. Jo, do you want to come back on any of those points?
No, well, just to add a couple of things. First of all, thank you very much for the question. And I completely agree with you that the experience of each and every one of our children and families is important. And, you know, those parents who took the time to complete the SEND survey, we're listening, we're taking very seriously what they've told us, and we're building that into our ongoing plans. Just so thank you to them all. Secondly, on the pandemic, I mean, throughout the pandemic, and I know you know this, but I'll say it anyway, throughout the pandemic, you know, the teams, far from, you know, continuing business as usual, really stepped up their response in the height of the pandemic, as the chair has said, really thinking about how do we work with all our children with SEND to where possible to make sure that they continue to attend school where that was the right thing for them and their families, working incredibly hard, not just with special schools, but mainstream schools, to make sure that they got the wraparound support needed so that they could continue with their education. We also, during the pandemic, did indeed recognise that a spike in demand might happen, and we were able during the pandemic to bring in some level of additional resources through the social care grant, which enabled us, for example, to put in place our specialist review team that David was talking about earlier. Now, that funding has now been baked into our budget moving forward as part of the IP, and we're delighted with that because we can see that it's making a difference. But certainly, you know, far from not projecting into the future, we were working incredibly hard to think about what demand might look like in the future and to put in place the responses we could, both in terms of SEND, but also in terms of how we might do that broader prevention piece for all our children and young people. So, for example, our Building Life Chances programme, which is really thinking about how we intervene to tackle some of the underpinning factors that are playing out at the moment in terms of increased levels of need and increased complexity of need. So a lot of work has gone into not just addressing need, but also preventing escalating need into the future. And that's probably enough from me, unless Jenny Newman wants to add anything that I've missed. Jenny, don't feel you have to. Only if you
no,
think
I think you've covered everything, Jo, that I would want to say. And just to reiterate, I think the teams have worked tirelessly and to continue to work to support those families, because there are still children and young people where parents perhaps are not fully confident for them to be in school full time. And we are continuing to work with those children and families to support them and to help them build the confidence to understand that they can be trusted to send their children to school.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Helen.
Thank you for the responses.
Thank you. Dee.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate there's well over 9,000 children across Hertfordshire with educational healthcare plans. What additional help can we offer parents whose children have an educational healthcare plan? That's my first question. The second part of my question is, clearly COVID has impacted the service going forward, and I think we all recognise that. I'm also wondering about how much longer, or what is the access time for young people to access CAMS, PALMS, and an OT, occupational therapist. And what are we doing to work with our partners, i.e. the NHS, to try and improve these pathways going forward? Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Dee. So in relation to CAMS, PALMS, etc., Sally might be able to give a quick response, but we're going to bring a report back at the next panel on this, you know, with a proper report and drill it down. So, and information, so who should we say? So Sally, do you want to come first back on those partnership, you know, CAMS, PALMS, etc.?
Yeah, and very good points that you've made there. The CAMS and PALMS we're currently working with the NHS to do a service redesign to look at putting more in around early help, because we've focused too much really at the top end and not at the preventative end. And Joella Scott is leading that on behalf of the County Council, and I think perhaps that might be a useful update also to have to this meeting on the progress of that, because that work's been going on now for about 18 months. And OTs, absolutely spot on there. We're really struggling with our OT service. Staff shortages has led to significant delays for families accessing the support, which is why we've gone down the route of putting in this quite a high bid to Schools Forum to increase the capacity, but also making sure we put in this again early intervention skills mix, so that we look at other people delivering some of the things like the training. We're improving the website and the resources on the website. We're trying to put in again that level of early help and prevention that's delivered by schools and by other professionals, so that we can free up the OTs we have to do the work we need. And as the chair says, that's focused of the report in April to this group.
Yeah, in relation to support for parents, obviously we're looking at we're looking at the redesign of the whole how we deliver SEN services, but we do have the local offer web-based information, which contains quite a lot. And I believe, listening to officers, that HCT, who delivers our speech and language, etc., they have a web-based system as well, which has a Q&A type function to it, and they're going to try and tie them together to make it more functional for parents. So that's something that's coming. But I do appreciate, by having spoken to parents with children with SEN, not particularly anybody, as far as I'm aware, in the crisis group, but with HPCI, and they do point out to me that parents often don't have time to sit down and read, or, you know, find time to drill down into a website. So we do have to look at that, how we can deliver something more face-to-face if necessary. But I think that's all part of the redesign that Tony and his team are looking at. because we're breaking up the service into sort of teams that can really respond as parents would want it. Does officers want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I think it's worth saying that the restructure that we're hoping to be in place from the end of April, we can't give you full details of that at the moment because it's actually out to consultation. But we're looking at a model where we will have a statutory service divided into functional groups with really clear points of contact for parents, schools and settings. And then we will have a graduated response service, which will look at early intervention and support, particularly advice and support for parents and schools. And we want to make sure that our support is joined up. So where we've got advice and support from, for example, our educational psychology service, our advisory teacher service, our behaviour and attendance service, we do already work across the areas, and we have triage where we look at individual cases where there's need for support. But one of the big areas we want to improve is that communication with parents, so they're clear about where the support is coming from and that we're making sure that they have that direct line in to the support services that are available, because all our services are under pressure, and there's no point us suggesting otherwise. All of our services are under pressure, but there are a range of services that are desperately trying to support our families and children and to make sure they do so in a timely way. And that's what we want our new restructure to be able to focus on: far better communication and real clarity about where to go for the right support at the right time.
Yeah, and we've got our SENDIAS team, aren't they? And that's more of an independent advice service that we provide. Jo?
Can I just add, yes, we've got our SENDIAS service, and indeed through the IP we're investing additional resources into SENDIAS. But secondly, I do want to just add that actually a key source of information and support for every parent and child is, of course, the school, and particularly the SENCOs in schools. And often those are the first people that a parent will go to for help and guidance and support, and just trying to find out what else they can do to support their child. So we are looking at how we can continue to really build on our work with SENCOs across all of our schools. We're going to be piloting a consultation hub, pretty much mirroring the type of consultation hubs we have for schools around social care. We'll do the same for children, for schools around children with SEND. So SENCOs can reach out to a consultation hub and get some advice on the type of strategies and support that schools can put in place for children and young people, and the advice that they can give to parents. So we're looking at not just what can we as a council do, but actually how can we work with and influence our partners, our schools and health colleagues, so that they can also provide really good advice and support and interventions for children and young people.
Okay, thanks. Is that all right, Dee?
Yes, I think it makes it quite clear. There's a number of different strands to SEND, and it's making sure that we communicate and our partners communicate with our parents right across Hertfordshire. And I also welcome the additional funding into this service, because that will enhance the service going forward, and it can only be a beneficial thing to the residents within the county. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Can I just add, I think that is one of the challenges with everything we do, is communicating it, and making sure that everybody hears it. So that is one of the challenges that I know that Daniela has. So I have next Mark Watkin.
Thank you very much, Teresa, and thank you first of all to all the officers for your contributions to this discussion, this debate. Look, we absolutely understand that you have massive challenges and you are working as hard as you can to resolve those. But as Helen has pointed out, there is still a great gap between your intentions and your plans and what is perceived by a significant number of the families out there. And it really follows on the theme of what's just been discussed in the last few questions about communication. I think it's absolutely at the heart of why there is frustration and despair out there for so many families. They do feel isolated. They do feel it's gate kept away from them rather than people are engaged with them. And we know the reasons why. I mean, we just look at the caseloads and indeed, you know, it's extraordinary that officers continue to work committed as they are with caseloads of that volume. It must be overwhelming sometimes to think of the things they ought to be trying to do and can't. So my heart really does go out to them, as well as to the families. And I just really wanted to pick up a couple of things. You know, can we please just look again at how we communicate with families, how we share what we're trying to do with them? I had to go back to the SEND strategy consultations and, you know, the low take-up we had from families in engaging with that massive piece of work that you would have thought would have been really absolutely key to what they were looking for their children. And I forget the numbers, I don't have it to hand, but frankly, they were barely representative of that community, and the open events, you know, virtually no families could get to. I do think this authority has got to ask itself some deep questions about how well we engage with those families. We need to get them on board. We need them to be feeling that their voices are being heard. And somebody, I think it was Dee, mentioned proactive rather than reactive. And at the moment, I don't think they feel the proaction coming through. They just feel that it's a cry in the wilderness. I just wanted a couple of things. I was very interested by the reference to the digital portal and quite what that might represent in terms of access to information for families. As a reference to it, and I haven't put a note on it. And secondly, going on to appeals, I mean, what is the cost to the authority of having to take on these appeals? Apart from the human cost and the financial cost to families, I just wonder how much it costs the authority to have to go through the appeals process, because that's money that otherwise could be going in to improve the front line. So my main key is, can we please just look at better communication, better engagement? I know that's a massive challenge, but you know, they need to feel they're being heard. And secondly, just that particular issue about the appeals and the digital portal.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. I don't want to go back to the conversations that we've had when we adopted the SEND strategy. Officers clearly heard and understood that perhaps we hadn't hit, in quotes, as many people as we could have done at that time. But we were still coming out, and in relation to the sessions, we were just coming out of a lockdown, not the lockdown, a lockdown, and we didn't get that message out as far. I've already acknowledged, and I've already acknowledged this morning that we need to be able to communicate better. And having spoken to HPCI, I also heard that families don't necessarily have time to read portals and emails and things like that. So we are looking at different ways of communicating. We're currently pulling together some software stroke database, so we've got all the information in relation to the families in one place. So if we want to do a mail out to tell them about a consultation, that's there. I'm assuming that we will also start trying to use, if we can, more the schools. But again, during the SEND strategy, consultation, that was again during those times when schools were struggling just to teach children. So there's a limit to what we can ask our partners to do, and there's also a limit in what we're able to do. But I have to say, we do want to hear from families, and I have read all the emails that I've received, and I receive them all the time. I mean, the emails from the SEND crisis group were not new to me. The content was not new to me, and I do hear from parents all the time, and we respond as well as we can. The digital portal, I'm talking about the local offer, and it's how we connect up. So I'm not quite sure what the digital portal is, unless you're referring, Mark, to where EHCPs, etc., are uploaded by the school and then downloaded, then uploaded. I'm not quite sure how well that's working at the moment. So that's something I'll ask officers to respond to. And then costs of appeal. Again, I think that comes with the complaints process when we report it. But that's something that we can ask to come forward, because I don't think we've got that here today, and we need to make sure that we've got the data right. But can I ask somebody to respond on digital portals, please? Jenny, you're on mute.
You can see Jenny's talking, she's on mute.
Oh, sorry, I've
I
got
didn't know
Keely
you were
with
talking to
me and she
yourself.
was asking me a question right at the wrong moment. In terms of the digital portal, I think I think, Mark, you're probably referring to the Liquid Logic portal, and it's actually working very well. We're rolling it out at the moment with our special schools, and the next phase is with our colleges. We're also working with Liquid Logic at developing a parent portal. To be completely honest about it, it's not as developed as we would like, and we have got officers at a senior level getting involved to make sure that development is taken forward. In the ideal world, we would really like a portal that was absolutely interactive and parents were able to access the same information that the local authority holds on their child. In practice, there is no authority and no database that seems to yet have that function, but it is something that Liquid Logic have agreed they're committed to, and Mim Kendrick has been working with Liquid Logic and Jenny Eccles in the development of that portal. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add, David. I know that we have a lot of meetings where we're talking about its development. Parents and schools are very pleased with the online work that's being done in terms of EHCP, and that is really improving the annual review process, the processing of paperwork and the timeliness of paperwork getting back to parents so they have up-to-date EHCPs. The parent portal is less well developed, but we're now working on.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for that update. So cost of appeals, David, Joe?
I mean, Jenny might want to come in at her service, but what I would say is the cost of appeals will be on a number of levels, both first and foremost for parents and children who are going through the process, but secondly, staff time, staff not just in the council, but staff in health services in terms of going to the appeal, and then of course the outcome of the appeal and the cost to do with the provision that's been agreed through a tribunal process. What I would say is that nobody wants to go through that. Parents certainly don't want to go through tribunal. They only do it when they feel they have no other option. And we don't want to have to go through that process either. So as part of our rethinking of how we deliver statutory consent, we have put at the front and centre of what we're doing the reconciliation team that Jenny and David were talking about earlier, which is all about, first of all, how you engage with families early on in order to resolve issues before they escalate and before anyone needs to go through tribunal process. So we're looking at that piece that Mark was talking about, communication, engagement with families, really thinking through with them how we can meet their children's needs and where possible, preventing the need to go through the tribunal process. Jenny, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult to estimate what cost is spent on tribunals. And I think what we are trying to focus on with reconciliation and resolution is making sure that we're doing the complex casework. So when we talked about number of complaints, if we are able to intervene early and resolve some of those difficulties, which offer and around what a mainstream school might be providing to support a child with complex needs. And mainstream schools are struggling. They need that support and advice. And some of that is because it's post-pandemic and they've got children coming back who aren't learning ready. And those with SEND, that's even more complex. Parents then feel very frustrated and they feel that specialist provision is the only route to go down. And they go to the tribunal in order to make sure that that can be formally agreed and the local authority then has a duty to implement whatever is in the plan. There are some appeals that are unavoidable. We do have to be mindful of public expenditure. We know that in some ways it's an inequitable system. The money that gets spent on tribunals, we would love to be being shared out to those children and families and money going into schools where we know it's needed. So what we want that resolution and reconciliation team is to really intervene early, to resolve some of those difficulties early, and therefore parents hopefully will not see the need to go to appeal to get what they want. We'll never turn it around completely. There will always be parents that choose the litigious route, and there will be cases that we have to defend on behalf of the local authority. But we're working to make it a far less adversarial process. We want to be talking in simple, plain English to families so they understand. And the other thing that we need to work on is the offer from our mainstream schools. So the funding, the new funding system is part of that work, but it's not just about funding. It's about schools offering a consistent offer for children with SEND across Hertfordshire. And that word inclusion that we probably haven't heard for a long time from the government is something that we know we need across all our schools and settings. And it's something we want to work towards in terms of the offer from all our schools in Hertfordshire.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. Just with that word inclusion, I do know that that's going to be included in the SEND review. So, yeah, Mark Mills-Bishop, please.
A very quick comment, if I may, Terry, just to say I just welcome what Jenny said about schools' engagement, and I also welcome the banding that's replaced the exceptional needs funding, which was a most awful process that was no help to families of any real significance. So I don't want to sound like entirely critical. I think you're doing some very good things there, and I welcome anything we can do to get more support into schools so that families can have their children educated in a mainstream environment. That has to be the right approach. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mark Mills-Bishop.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and I shall be very quick. I'm conscious of the time. It's a question to Sally, actually, regarding recruitment, and because we can't do any of this unless we got the people there on the ground doing the work. I was at a school on Friday and they were telling me, particularly around speech and language, that they haven't got the resource for that. And I just wondered what your thoughts were, Sally, because I know you're very good at this, and you're going to prepare a report. And when you do a report, can you make sure you're big, bold and brave when that report comes to our panel? But I want to know why we can't get the recruits in, or the courses. Are we liaising with universities, colleges, that kind of thing, to get the people to come into the profession? Thank you.
To be honest, we weren't, and we've really had to take a long look at our workforce across the therapies. A number of reasons we're struggling with. We're struggling to retain staff in Hertfordshire. Partly that's because staff get paid more if they go across borders into London, but also we didn't have a good sort of career structure for our therapy staff. So we're looking in the new specification about addressing that. There's also an issue about, well, to be honest, the current dissatisfaction with the service means we've got a real increase in the number of tribunals that clinicians are now involved with, and they feel quite strongly that that's not what they came into the profession to do, to be appearing in court all the time rather than delivering clinically, and that has caused a number of our therapists to decide to leave the service. So we're looking at addressing that within the new contract specification as well. We're looking at golden handshakes, bringing back retired staff. We've got some locums, and we also actually, when we went to Schools Forum for the first time, really good feedback from some of the secondary heads about having a one-size piece of paper about it as a profession for some of our children in school, which we haven't done before. We're working with the University of Hertfordshire on their model for recruiting teachers, because that's been really successful, about offering placements within the county and sort of growing our own that way, and also about apprenticeships, which is something that's quite new to this sort of sector. So we are looking at all different angles of that, and I'll make sure I include that in the report that I bring next time, because it is that, otherwise we can't deliver. We can't deliver if we can't get staff.
And I just need to be clear that when Sally says we in this context, this is local authority and NHS, and it's the NHS that is responsible for the provision of speech and language therapy professionals. So we need to be, it's very much a partnership. It's not, we've got the statutory responsibility to deliver, but we actually have to commission other bodies, and one of those bodies is the NHS. So it's about those professionals actually understanding their responsibility too, and that's the piece of work that's going to go on and continue, I should say, with the integrated care system and how we all work together. So yeah, just want to make it clear it's other people as well who have challenging times as well as us.
Okay,
So
thank you for that.
Thanks.
Yep.
So right, where is it? I've lost it. We're now going to oh, here we are. So the recommendation is the panel is asked to scrutinise current performance and comment on any areas for improvement and/or interest. I think we've done that really well. So thank you to all the officers of standing up to that. And could you agree, not agree, put in a comment in the chat. Thank you. Thank you. And I think Anthony's left the meeting, hasn't he?
Yes, Teresa, he has.
Yeah, thank you. So Nigel's abstaining as well, rather than noting, or noting and abstaining, I should say. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to plough on because I know it's 2 o'clock, isn't it? We've got our safeguarding briefing to members, so so I'm very conscious of that. So we've got now item 7, which is a response to motions remitted from the County Council to this panel. And these were motions that Mark Watkin and Nigel Bell brought to full council, and there wasn't time to debate as we were operating under restricted conditions at the time. So Nigel and Mark, I'm going to offer you 3 minutes, shall we say, to speak to your motions. And then, as you are aware, I have sent out in advance recommendations towards this particular item. I tried to bring together what I was reading in the motions from both Mark and Nigel so that we could make a condensed response, as it were. And I hope that was helpful. I hear exactly what you're saying. So, yeah. So who should we start with? Mark.
Thank you, Teresa. Actually, I'm not going to spend very much time on speaking to this motion. I think, in a sense, it represents all that we've been discussing for the last hour and a half, and it's particularly, if you recall, aiming actually at the action that you should take, or was it the council leader, to write to the minister about the inequitable funding of high-level needs funding. And I note that that has been done, and I would like to know what response that has achieved. And because of this, and because I think this panel has spoken volubly about our concerns for special needs, I'm not going to rerun the whole issues that we've just been going through. I recognise that all sides of the political spectrum see this as a massive challenge for our community and for our young, and we just think that somehow Hertfordshire is not getting the full range of support that it ought to be getting from the government in terms of high-level needs funding. You made the point in that last discussion about, or Jenny did, about the need of schools to be able to offer a comprehensive level of support to families, to their children, and that they can't do that if they're hamstrung by the amount of money that they can offer. And so it's at the core of actually being able to get help to the children at the front line, if you can call it that, at the first point of contact. How much better it would be if children do not feel, or families do not feel they've got to go down the educational healthcare plan route because the schools are well set up to support their children. And we know there are good schools. You know, there are some excellent schools, and we could ask for the data. I suspect that education healthcare plans in good schools are probably fewer, and the ones that come out of those good schools are the ones that desperately need it. But when the schools don't deliver, then unfortunately, what else can families do? They have to seek help wherever they can find it. So it is critical to get the better service to our community that the schools get adequate funding. And I'm sorry to say that somehow getting more for Hertfordshire means there's less for Derbyshire or something just doesn't cut it. Hertfordshire families deserve as much right to their level of support in those schools as any other community. And it's not a question of levelling up or levelling down, it's just equitability. And I think that's all I want to say. I think, you know, the rest, I recognise your document, or document that's come from the authority from Jo and her team this morning, and thank you for that. And, you know, all I can say is in your national position, please, 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 just never let up. You know, our children deserve better. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Yep, absolutely agree. And that's why I actually pulled this together myself. Can I say that? Officers just check the numbers. So there we go. This is me speaking here, and these recommendations. I thought it was easier than having another motion. Just to say, I only gave the minister the letter last Tuesday. Time flies. I haven't received a response back yet, but I handed it to him in person. Not the Secretary of State, but I handed one to the Minister to take back to the Secretary of State. But I will be chasing that probably early next week. Nigel.
Thank you, Chair. And yeah, like what similar to what Mark has said. Obviously, I think the key thing was, I'm not going to go on and on, because key thing was that we've had this a long debate this morning, which is certainly needed. And I think, especially to many of those parents who've written in, they will at least see that we're all taking this very seriously. But clearly, and I accept that the comments you made at the start were, certainly from my point of view, different from the comments you made in November. You're in full listening mode now, and that's what we want. And we want to see full consultation to everybody, and that's fine. That's good. I mean, partly my motion. Well, first of all, talking about Mark's and obviously the high needs funding, that's something that's key. And that, yes, as Mark said, we'd like to see you obviously carrying on lobbying your central government party to try and get a better deal for us in Hertfordshire on the high needs funding, which is so important. But on the reason we put ours forward clearly was to recognise what those parents who had originally taken part in the October consultation, and we wanted to make sure that was recognised. Now, clearly, that has been better recognised, I think, today, and we just need to see better outcomes, as colleagues said earlier, for all parents, whether it's the 170 or 130 odd, or whether it's just 10. They all must be taken seriously. I take on board the fact that you say you read all the emails, and that's important, and you have read them and going to respond to them, as I will. So the key thing to come out of this should be that all of us, support what you're doing now, what your officers have. It's been very difficult, I know, for Jo and her team, but they've done very well to do what they are doing, but they do need those more resources. The resources are going to go in and start to make an effect, we hope, in the next month or two, added on to what's happening now. But if the thing that goes out, the main point that goes out from here is that we're all now going to be listening even more to what all parents say, then, I'd be happy with that. But clearly we have to watch and clearly scrutinise in the next meetings and as time goes on. And that's what I'll be doing. So I accept what you've said today. It would be nice to have had your reply earlier than this morning, but it's there. And, well, let's see what the minister comes back with. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nigel. Thank you for that. Thank you, colleagues. Can I just reiterate that if I've given the impression that I have not recognised or understood the experiences of all parents, I apologise. I always have done. And I take my role extremely seriously, and do try to make sure that we do the best for our families. Yeah, so I'm hopeful that giving you the time today to have this conversation, I'll call it a conversation rather than a debate, about the service that is provided via our statutory SEN and SEN officers, we're trying to show you what we're trying to do, and we've recognised that at the moment we are doing what we can with what we've got. Now, I agree with you that not getting the full formula is not right, and I know that we've been trying to work on this for years, and the Minister DFE do recognise what we're saying, but I really do not know what the outcome will be. I'm hoping that the SEN review will have a relook at how the whole system, because it's a whole system, it's not just local authorities, it's the NHS, it's the voluntary sector, how it all works together. And that's really what I'm hoping will come out of the SEN review. There's a bigger picture where we can all work together for the benefit of all our children and young people. So with that in mind, the recommendations are set out. I can read them with people. Shall I read them out so that everybody on the call can actually hear what we're saying? So, and I'm afraid there's 13 paragraphs, so bear with me. This panel notes the motions from Councillor Watkin and Councillor Bell and thanks them for their contributions. The panel recognises the experiences of all parents and carers with children with SEND, including those parents who took part in the SEND National Crisis Hertfordshire Survey during October 21 and January 22. The panel thanks those operating HPCI, that's the Hertfordshire Parent Carer Involvement Group, for their constant work with the authority to improve the outcomes of SEND children, and to the National Crisis Organisers for their work on the survey. This panel understands the issues raised and the concerns and challenges faced by all families. This panel notes and welcomes the programme of redesign for the SEND service, which will be for the benefit of all children and families with SEND. This panel supports the SEND strategy brought to a previous panel, particularly in its impact in broadening the scope of services supplied to Hertfordshire families, and in its aim to engage more closely with the Hertfordshire families, delivering greater local choices and ensuring that the voice of the children and their parents will be heard. This panel recognises that one of the key issues for the SEND service has been the 150% growth in education healthcare plans in the last years, which has resulted in excessive case workload being placed upon the SEND team. It's thanks to these teams for their hard work and dedication, but recognises the change programme is required. The panel recognises the 39.2 million being spent in 21-22 on supporting the needs of some 9,000 children in the county with special educational needs and disabilities. This excludes high needs educational funding, and this 39.2 rising to 44.6 in 22-23. The panel notes the additional 1.5 million spend in the year 21-22 and the 2 million in the AIP being available to enable the change programme of the statutory SEND service so that additional officers will be recruited, caseload numbers reduced, greater specialisation created within teams, and the quality of support and communications with families will be radically improved. The panel welcomes the Council's project supported by Empower, focusing on reducing the demand for children's high need provision in Hertfordshire. The panel welcomes the whole Council recognition of the problems facing families with SEND, demonstrated, for instance, by the additional corporate resource in the Customer Care Centre. The panel acknowledges the greater support being provided to schools and the planned provision of 13 additional specialist autism hubs and 300 additional special school places, which will come on stream over the next 5 years. The panel notes that the demands on the high needs budget are such that overspends of over 4 million in 23-24 and over 10 million in 24-25 are currently projected. The current formula has resulted in Hertfordshire being the 4th lowest funded local authority per capita terms. And finally, The panel welcomes the recent letter to the Secretary of State and Children's Minister by the executive member, calling for the amendment of the high needs formula, and calls upon the executive member to continue to lobby for additional support for Hertfordshire's SEND children and families, and to influence the forthcoming publication of the SEND review. So these recommendations will appear in the minutes of the meeting, so members of the public can see them. But can I ask members of the panel to vote for, against, or abstain, please?
Terry, can I just say that must be the longest set of recommendations any panels have been asked to agree to.
I know, but it's such an important subject, isn't it? We have to cover everything.
You'll see the click gone.
Agreed.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I do apologise for not circulating it earlier, but I've been doing a lot of thinking. Okay, so I think we're there on that one. So colleagues and officers, thank you so much for your consideration, remarks and answers this morning. It was a really, really good debate. We don't often get the chance to debate something quite so thoroughly, but I think it's really been useful. And I hope that we continue to work across council and all political parties to deliver the best service for all the families, for all the children, I should say, children and young people and the families and their families in Hertfordshire around SEND, and obviously for all the other services, children in care, social care, families first, etc. So I don't want to leave anybody out, but I'm just want to say we do work well as a group together, and I just want to keep that going. So thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you all at the safeguarding briefing a bit later on, if you're able to. So thank you very much indeed. Cheers. Thanks very much.
2:30. Thanks.
Thank you. 2:30.